officials for all their work in producing this document. Now let me explain what it has uncovered. Mr. Speaker, the government published its plans for day-to-day spending in the spring budget in March. But when I arrived at the Treasury on the very first day, I was alerted by officials that this was not how much the previous government expected to spend this year. It wasn't even close. In fact, the total pressures on these budgets across a range of areas was an additional £35 billion. Once you account for the slippage in budgets you usually see over a year and the reserve of £9 billion designed to respond to genuinely unexpected events, it means, Mr. Speaker, that we have inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion. A £22 billion hole in the public finances now. Not in the future, but now. £22 billion of spending this year that was covered up by the party opposite. If left unaddressed, it would mean a 25% increase in the budget deficit this year. So I will today set out the necessary and urgent work that I have already done to reduce that pressure on the public finances by £5.5 billion this year and over £8 billion next year. Let me be clear. I'm not talking about costs for future years that they signed up to but did not include, like the compensation for infected blood, which has cross-party support. I'm not talking about the state of public services in the future, like the crisis in our prisons, which they have left for us to fix. I'm talking about the money that they were already spending this year and had no ability to pay for, which they hid from the country. They had exhausted the reserve, and they knew that, but nobody else did. Yet they ducked the difficult decisions. They put party before country. And they continued to make unfunded commitment after unfunded commitment, knowing that the money was not there, resulting in the position that we have now inherited. The reserve, spent more than 3 times over, only 3 months into the financial year. And they told no one. Mr. Speaker, the scale of this overspend is not sustainable. Not to act is simply not an option. We have already seen official ONS figures this month showing that borrowing is higher this year than the OBR expected. And the disaster of Liz Truss's mini-budget shows what happens if you don't take tough decisions to maintain economic stability. Some, including the leader of the opposition and the Shadow Chancellor, have claimed the books were open. How dare they? It is not true. And let me tell you why. There are very clear instances of specific budgets that were overspent and unfunded promises that were made, but that, crucially, the OBR was not aware of for their March forecast. I will now take each of these in turn. First, the asylum system. The forecast for the number of asylum seekers has risen dramatically since the last spending review, and costs for asylum support have risen 7-fold in the past 3 years. But instead of reflecting these costs in the Home Office budget for this year, the previous government covered up the true extent of this crisis and its spending implications. The document I am publishing today reveals a projected overspend on the asylum system, including their failed Rwanda plan, for this year alone, of more than £6.4 billion. That was unfunded and it was undisclosed. Next, in the wake of the pandemic, demand for rail services fell. But instead of developing a proper plan to adjust for this new reality, the government handed out cash to rail companies to make up for passenger shortfalls, but failed to budget for this adequately. Because of that, and because of industrial action, there is now an overspend of £1.6 billion in the transport budget. That was unfunded and it was undisclosed. Mr. Speaker, since 2022, the government, with the support of this whole House, has rightly provided military assistance to Ukraine in response to the Russian invasion. The spending audit has found that there was not enough money set aside for the reserve to fund all these costs. We will continue to honour these commitments in full. And unlike the previous government, we will make sure that they are always fully funded. On top of these new pressures, since 2021, inflation was above the Bank of England's target for 33 months in a row, hitting 11% at its peak. But the previous government had not held a spending review since 2021. That means they never fully reflected the impact of inflation in departmental budgets. This has had a direct impact on budgets for public sector pay. When the last spending review was conducted, it was assumed that pay awards would be 2% this year. Ordinarily, the government is expected to give evidence to the pay review bodies on affordability. But extraordinarily, this year, the previous government provided no guidance on what could or could not be afforded to the pay review bodies. This is almost unheard of, but that is exactly what they did. Worse still, the former Education Secretary had the pay review body recommendation sitting on her desk. But instead of responding and dealing with the consequences, they shirked the decisions that needed to be taken. I will not repeat their mistakes. Where the previous government provided no transparency to the public and no certainty for public services, we will be open about the decisions which are needed and the steps that we are taking. That begins with accepting in full the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies, and the details of these awards are being published today. That is the right decision for the people who work in, and most importantly, the people who use our public services, giving hard-working staff the pay rises they deserve, while ensuring that we can recruit and retain the people we need. It should not have taken this long to come to these decisions, and I do not want to be in this position again. So I will consider options to reform the timetable for responding to the pay review bodies in the future. This decision is in the best interests of our economy too. The last government presided over the worst set of strikes in a generation. This caused chaos and misery for the British public, and it wreaked havoc on the public finances. Industrial action in the NHS alone cost the taxpayer £1.7 billion last year. That is why I am pleased to announce today that the government has agreed an offer to the junior doctors, which the BMA are recommending to their members. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will set out further details. Let me pay tribute to him. His leadership on this issue has paved the way to ending a dispute which has caused waiting lists to spiral, operations to be delayed and agony for patients to be prolonged. Today marks the start of a new relationship between the government and staff working in our National Health Service, and the whole country will welcome that. Mr. Speaker, where the previous government ducked the difficult decisions, I am taking action, because knowing what they did about the state of the public finances, they continued to make unfunded commitment after unfunded commitment that they knew they could not afford, putting party before country, leaving us with an overspend of £22 billion this year. Where they presided over recklessness, I will bring responsibility. I will take immediate action. Let me set this out in detail. First, on pay. I have today set out our decision to meet the recommendation of the pay review bodies. Because the previous government failed to prepare for these recommendations in their departmental budgets, they come at an additional cost of £9 billion this year. So the first difficult choice I am making is to ask all departments to find savings to absorb as much of this as possible, totalling at least £3 billion. To support departments as they do this, I will work with them to find savings ahead of the autumn budget, including through measures to stop all non-essential spending on consultancy and government communications. And I am taking action to ask departments to find 2% savings in their back office costs. Mr. Speaker, I will now deal with a series of commitments made by the previous government which they did not fund, because if we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. First, at Conservative Party conference last year, the former Prime Minister announced the introduction of a new qualification, the Advanced British Standard. That is a commitment costing nearly £200 million next year, rising to billions across future years. Mr. Speaker, this was supposed to be the former Prime Minister's legacy, but it turns out he didn't put aside a single penny to pay for it. So we will not go ahead with that policy, because if we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. Next year, the Illegal Migration Act, passed by the previous government, made it impossible to process asylum applications or remove people who have no right to be here. Instead, they relied on a doomed policy to send asylum seekers to Rwanda on planes that never took off, leaving tens of thousands of people stuck in hotels on the public purse. We need a properly controlled and managed asylum system where rules are enforced so that those with no right to be here are swiftly removed. So we have scrapped their failed Rwanda scheme, which placed huge pressure on the Home Office budget. To bring down these costs as soon as possible, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has already laid legislation to remove the retrospective element of the Illegal Migration Act, which will significantly reduce the use of hotel accommodation. These measures will save nearly £800 million this year and avoid costs spiralling even further next year. This was a bad use of taxpayers' money, and we will not do it. Mr. Speaker, the previous government claimed it was levelling up the country. It made promise after promise to the British people. But the spending audit has uncovered that some of those commitments weren't worth the paper that they were written on. At autumn statement last year, the former Chancellor announced £150 million for an investment opportunity fund. But not a single project has been supported from that fund. So following discussions with my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, I am cancelling it today. Because if we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. The previous government also made a series of commitments on transport, promises that people expected to be delivered, promises that many members across this House campaigned on in good faith. But the party opposite has failed them. We have seen from the National Audit Office the chaos that the previous government presided over. Projects over budget and delayed again and again. The spending audit has revealed £1 billion of unfunded transport projects that have been committed to next year. So my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will undertake a thorough review of these commitments. As part of that work, she has agreed not to move forwards with projects that the previous government refused to publicly cancel, despite knowing full well that they were unaffordable. That includes proposed work on the A303 and the A27. And my right honourable friend will also cancel the Restoring Our Railway programme, saving £85 million next year, with individual projects to be assessed through her review. If we cannot afford it, we cannot do it. Mr. Speaker, the previous government had plans. The previous government had plans for a retail sale of NatWest shares. We intend to fully exit our shareholding in NatWest by 2025-26. But having considered advice, I have concluded that a retail share sale offer would involve significant discounts that could cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds. It would therefore not represent value for money, and it will not go ahead. It is a bad use of taxpayers' money, and we will not do it. Next, let me address the unfunded pressures in our NHS and our social care sector. In October 2020, the government announced that 40 new hospitals would be built by 2030. Since then, only one new project has opened to patients, and only 6 have started their main construction activity. The National Audit Office were clear that delivery was wildly off track. But since coming into office, it has become clear that the previous government continued to maintain its commitment to 40 hospitals without anywhere close to the funding required to deliver them. That gave our constituents false hope. We need to be straight with the British people about what is deliverable and what is affordable. So we will conduct a complete review of the new hospital programme with a thorough, realistic and costed timetable for delivery. Mr. Speaker, adult social care was also neglected by the previous government. The sector needs reform to improve care and to support staff. In the previous Parliament, the government made costly commitments to introduce adult social care reform charges, but they delayed them 2 years ago because they knew that local authorities were not ready and that their promises were not funded. So it will not be possible to take forward those charging reforms. This will save over £1 billion by the end of next year. Mr. Speaker.
Order. I want this side to be quiet as well. I want to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
I can understand why people and members are angry. I am angry too. The previous government let people down. Mr. Speaker, the previous government made commitment after commitment without knowing where the money was going to come from. They did this repeatedly, knowingly and deliberately. Today I am calling out the Conservatives' cover-up, and I am taking the first steps to clean up what they have left behind. But the scale of the inheritance we have been left means the decisions we have so far announced will not be enough. This level of overspend is not sustainable. Left unchecked, it is a risk to economic stability. And unlike the party opposite, I will never take risks with our country's economic stability. So it therefore falls to us to take the difficult decisions now to make further in-year savings. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the situation we are dealing with means incredibly tough choices. I repeat today the commitment that we made in our manifesto to protect the triple lock. But today I am making the difficult decision that those not in receipt of pension credit or certain other means-tested benefits will no longer receive the winter fuel payment from this year onwards. The Government will continue to provide winter fuel payments worth £200 to households receiving pension credit, or £300 to households in receipt of pension credit with someone over the age of 80. Let me be clear, this is not a decision I wanted to make, nor is it the one that I expected to make. But these are the necessary and urgent decisions that I must make. It is the responsible thing to do, to fix the foundations of our economy and bring back economic stability. Alongside this change, I will work with my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, to maximise the take-up of pension credit by bringing forward the administration of housing benefit and pension credit, repeatedly pushed back by the previous government, and by working with older people's charities and local authorities to raise awareness of pension credit and help identify households not claiming it. Mr. Speaker, this is the beginning of a process, not the end. I am announcing today that I will hold a budget on October the 30th, alongside a full economic and fiscal forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. I have to tell the House that the budget will involve taking difficult decisions to meet our fiscal rules across spending, welfare and tax. Mr. Speaker, they still don't get it today. Parties in Downing Street crushing the economy, gambling on the election, party before country every single time. Mr. Speaker, it will be a budget to fix the foundations of our economy, and it will be a budget built on the principles that this new government was elected on. First, we will treat taxpayers' money with respect by ensuring that every pound is well spent. And we will interrogate every line of public spending to ensure it represents value for money. Second, I can repeat from the dispatch box our manifesto commitment that we will not increase taxes on working people. That means we will not increase national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax or VAT. And today, my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, is publishing further detail on our manifesto commitments to close tax loopholes and clamp down on tax avoidance, to ensure we bring in that money as quickly as possible. My third principle is that we will meet our fiscal rules. We will move the current budget into balance, and we will get debt falling as a share of our economy by the end of the forecast. These are the principles that will guide me at the budget. But let me be honest, challenging trade-offs will still remain. So today I am launching a multi-year spending review. This review will set departmental budgets for at least 3 years, providing the long-term certainty that has been lacking for too long. As part of that process, final budgets for this year and budgets for next year, 2025-26, will be set alongside the budget on the 30th of October. I will look closely at our welfare system, because if you can work, you should work. That is a principle of this government. Yet under the previous government, welfare spending ballooned, while inactivity has risen sharply in recent years. So we will ensure that the welfare system is focused on supporting people into employment. And we will assess the unacceptable levels of fraud and error in our welfare system and take forward action to bring that down. Mr. Speaker, to fix the foundations of our economy, we must ensure that never again can a government keep from the public the true state of our public finances. The fiscal framework which I have inherited had several flaws. It allowed the government to run down the clock on departmental budgets, to avoid difficult decisions and push them back beyond the election. So I am announcing the most significant set of changes to our framework since the inception of the Office for Budget Responsibility. These changes will come into effect in the autumn. First, we have introduced legislation to ensure we can never again see a repeat of the mini-budget. Second, We will require the Treasury to share with the Office for Budget Responsibility its assessment of immediate public spending pressures and enshrine that rule in the Charter for Budget Responsibility, so that no government can ever again cover up the true state of our public finances. And finally, we will ensure that never again do public service budgets get set at only a few months' notice. Instead, spending reviews will take place every 2 years with a minimum planning horizon of 3 years to avoid uncertainty for departments and to bring stability to our public finances. I have already spoken to the Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility to brief him on the findings of our audit and our reforms. Mr. Speaker, by launching the spending review, I am also today starting the firing gun on a new approach to public service reform to drive greater productivity in the public sector. We will embed an approach to government that is mission-led, that is reform-driven, with the greatest focus on prevention and integration of services at both a national and local level, and that is enabled by new technology, including through the work of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, on the opportunities of AI to improve our public services. We will establish a new Office of Value for Money, with an immediate focus on identifying areas where we can reduce, stop or improve the value of spending. And we will appoint a COVID Corruption Commissioner to bring back money that is owed to taxpayers after contracts worth billions of pounds were handed out to the previous government during the pandemic. Ahead of the spending review, I will also review the cost of our political system, including restricting eligibility for ministerial severance payments based on time in office. I expect all levels of government to be run effectively and efficiently, and I will work with leaders across our country to deliver just that. That means effective local government, a civil service delivering good value for the British taxpayer, and reform of our political institutions, including the House of Lords, to keep costs as low as possible. Mr. Speaker, the Budget and Spending Review will also set out further progress on our #1 mission, to grow our economy, because economic growth is the only way to sustainably improve our public services and sustainably improve our public finances. So we will use the Spending Review to prioritise specific areas of capital investment that leverage in billions more in private investment. It won't happen overnight, it will take time and it will take focus, but we have already made significant progress. Planning reforms to get Britain building, a national wealth fund to catalyse private investment, a pensions investment review to unlock capital for our businesses, Skills England to create shared national ambition to boost skills across our country, and work across government on a new industrial strategy, driven forward by a growth mission board to ensure we deliver on our commitments. Our country has fundamental strengths on which we can build, and I look forward to welcoming business leaders to the International Investment Summit in Britain later this year. Because I know that if we can create the stable conditions which investors need to thrive, we will return confidence to our economy, so that entrepreneurs and businesses, big and small, know that this is the best place in the world to start and grow a business, because that is the bedrock on which economic growth must be built. Mr. Speaker, the inheritance from the previous government is unforgivable. After the chaos of Partygate, when they knew trust in politics was at an all-time low, they gave false hope to Britain. When people were already being hurt by their cost of living crisis, they promised solutions that they knew could never be paid for. Roads that would never be built, public transport that would never arrive, hospitals that would never treat a single patient. They spent like there was no tomorrow, because they knew that someone else would pick up the bill. And then in the election, and perhaps this is the most shocking part, they campaigned on a platform to do it all over again. More unfunded tax cuts, more spending pledges, but all the time knowing they had no ability to pay for them. No regard for the taxpayer, no respect for ordinary hard-working people. I will never do that. I will restore our country's economic stability. I will make the tough choices. I will fix the foundations of our economy, so we can rebuild Britain and make every part of our country better off. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Chancellor for advance sight of her statement, and I echo her thoughts for the people and emergency services of Southport. Today, she will fool absolutely no one with a shameless attempt to lay the grounds for tax rises she didn't have the courage to tell us about.
Order, order, order. Now then, this is the Cabinet. I want it to act like a Cabinet, like a rabble that's trying to show the Shadow Chancellor. Jeremy Hunt.
She says, Mr. Speaker, the information is new. But she herself told the Financial Times, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of public finances, as we've got the OBR now. Paul Johnson of the IFS says the state of public finances were apparent pre-election to anyone who cared to look, which is why he and other independent figures say her argument is not credible and won't wash. Those public finances were audited by the OBR just 10 weeks before the election was called. We're now expected to believe that in that short period, a £20 billion black hole has magically emerged. But every single day in that period, in fact since January, in line with constitutional convention, she has had privileged access to the Treasury Permanent Secretary. She could find out absolutely anything she needed. So will she confirm today to the House she did have meetings with the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury before the election? Will she tell the House if they discussed public finances? Will she tell the House if they discussed any of the pressures she's talking about today? And if so, why are we only hearing today what she wants to do about them? That's why today's exercise is not economic, it's political. She wants to blame the last Conservative government for tax rises and project cancellations she's been planning all along. The trouble is, even her own published numbers expose the fiction behind today's announcement. Just 4 days ago, she presented to the House the government's estimates of spending plans for the year. Those estimates are a legal requirement, and the official guidance manual is clear. Departments are responsible for ensuring that estimates are consistent with their best forecast of requirements. They're signed off by the most senior civil servants, the accounting officers in every department. Yet 4 days on, the Chancellor is saying those estimates are wrong. So who's right, politically neutral civil servants or a political Chancellor? If she's right, will she ask the Cabinet Secretary to investigate those civil servants? And will she apologise to the House for laying misleading estimates? Of course not, because she knows those civil servants are right, and today's black hole is spurious. Just like when she says she inherited the worst set of economic circumstances since the Second World War. When BBC Verify asked a professor at the London School of Economics about that claim, he responded, I struggle to find a metric that would make that statement correct. Because, Mr. Speaker, the metrics speak for themselves. Inflation is 2% today, nearly half what it was in 2010, when we had to clear up the mess inherited from a Labour government. Unemployment is nearly half what it was then, with more new jobs than nearly anywhere else in Europe. And so far this year, we're the fastest growing G7 economy. And over the next 6 years, the IMF say we will grow faster than France, Italy, Germany or Japan. Indeed, just 2 days before the election was called, the managing director of the IMF praised the previous government's handling of the economy and said it was in a good place. This week, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said it was not a bad situation to take charge of and certainly not comparable to the 1940s or 1970s. Mr. Speaker, if you're in charge of the economy, it's time to stop trash talking it. What's the point of going to New York or Brazil to bang the drum for more investment if you come home with a cock and bull story about how bad everything is? She should stop playing politics with Britain's reputation and get on with running the economy. So when it comes to public finances, Will she confirm to the House that far from being broke and broken, as Downing Street briefed the media, the forecast deficit today is 4.4% compared to 10.3% when Labour left office in 2010. In other words, when Labour was last in office, we were borrowing double current levels. And will she confirm another difference between today and 2010? The Conservatives came to office then being honest about our plans and saying very straightforwardly we needed to cut the deficit, whereas she's just won an election telling us repeatedly taxes will not go up. How many seats were won on the back of commitments not to raise tax, while she's quietly planning to do the exact opposite? So turning to the details she's announced today, will she confirm that around half today's fictitious black hole comes from discretionary public sector pay awards? In other words, not something she has to do, but something where she has a choice. Will she confirm to the House that apart from the teachers' recommendation, none of the other pay review body recommendations were seen by the last government as they arrived after the election was called? Now today, she has chosen to accept those recommendations. But before doing so, was she advised by officials to ask unions for productivity enhancements before accepting above-inflation pay awards to help pay for those awards, as the last government did? And if she was advised to do that, why did she reject that advice and simply tell the unions, here's your money, thanks for your support? Will she confirm? I know they don't like the truth, but here it is. Will she confirm that one of the reasons for her funding gap is that she's chosen to backdate a 22% pay award to junior doctors to cover the time when they were striking? Mr. Speaker, we are just 3 months into the financial year, so why did she not mention today that at the start of the year, the Treasury had a reserve of £14 billion for unexpected revenue costs and £4 billion for unexpected capital costs? Additionally, why has she not accounted for the Treasury's ability to manage down in-year pressures on the reserve, last year alone by £9 billion? Why has she apparently not accounted for underspends, typically £12 billion a year? Has she totally abandoned the £12 billion of welfare savings planned by the last government? And if so, will she confirm that to the House? Has she also abandoned £20 billion of annual productivity savings planned by the last government? And if not, why aren't they in her numbers? And finally, for someone who claims continuously the mantle of fiscal rectitude, will she confirm that in order to pay for her public spending plans, she will not change her fiscal rules to target a different debt measure so she can increase borrowing and debt by the back door? Every Chancellor faces pressures on public finances. After a pandemic and energy crisis, those pressures are particularly challenging, which is why in the autumn of 22, the previous government took painful but necessary decisions on tax and spend. But we knew going forward that if we continued to take difficult decisions on pay, productivity and welfare reform, we could live within our means and start to bring taxes down. She, on the other hand, knew perfectly well a Labour government would duck those difficult decisions. She's caved into the unions on pay, left welfare reform out of the King's speech, soft-pedalled on our productivity programme, and that is a choice, not a necessity. And that choice means that taxes will have to go up, and she chose not to tell us before the election. Instead, in 24 days, just 24 days, she's announced £7.3 billion for GB Energy, £8.3 billion for the National Wealth Fund, and around £10 billion for public sector pay awards. That's £24 billion in 24 days. Around £1 billion for every day she's been in office, leaving taxpayers to pick up the tab for her profligacy. And doing it this way, she makes the first major misstep of her time as Chancellor, because that great office of state depends more than any on trust. Yet in her first big moment, she breaks that trust with an utterly bogus attempt to hoodwink the public about the choices she has. Over 50 times in the election, they told us they had no plans to raise taxes. Now, in a U-turn that will forever shame this Labour government, she is laying the ground to break her word. And when she does, her first budget will become the biggest betrayal in history by a new Chancellor, and working families will never forgive her.
The Shadow Chancellor had an opportunity this afternoon to admit what he had done, the legacy that he had left. But instead, he takes no responsibility. The word the country was looking for today was sorry. The Shadow Chancellor could not find those words. No wonder the party opposite so definitively lost the trust of the British people at the election 3.5 weeks ago. And we say never again. Never again should a party who plays fast and loose with the public finance should be in charge of the public finance.
Order. Can I just say to the whips, you hold responsible jobs, and I expect you to keep them that way. Just because you might not be the end of the bench doesn't mean you're going to chunter all the way through and pass comment. I don't need it, and I won't put up with it. Chancellor.
So first of all, specifically on the black hole, we couldn't have known these numbers because the party opposite didn't tell the OBR these numbers. That is why we are in the position we are in today, and that is the biggest scandal of them all. The Shadow Chancellor asks about the estimates. Well, the estimates that we laid yesterday, he should recognise them because he produced them. Yep. We had to lay those estimates to allow public spending to continue. Yep. But since those estimates were produced, information was given to us by Treasury officials about the true scale of the overspending by the party opposite. And the Shadow Chancellor mentions the IFS. Well, Paul Johnson from the IFS has just said that it appears that these overspends are genuinely unfunded. The words not of me, but the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, which the Shadow Chancellor referenced. The Shadow Chancellor mentioned what happened to the reserve. Well, the reserve has been spent, Shadow Chancellor. It was spent by you 3 times over. That is why we are in a position of a £22 billion in-year gap between spending that was happening and the funding to produce it. Now, if the Shadow Chancellor could do all the things that he spoke about today, why weren't they in the forecasts? If he was able, as he says, to make those in-year changes on welfare and on productivity, then they would have been in the forecasts. They were not. On the issue of the pay review bodies, the previous government set the remit for the pay review bodies, but they refused to give them any indication of affordability. That is almost unprecedented. The teachers reported before the election, and that recommendation sat on the former Education Secretary's desk. Today we are drawing a line on the industrial action. The £1.7 billion cost to the NHS alone last year, 1.4 million cancelled appointments. And we are incorporating a third of those pay increases into efficiencies into our public services, as the Shadow Chancellor suggested that we should. And when it comes to tax, I'm not going to take any lessons from the party opposite. The party opposite who took the tax burden to the highest level in 70 years. Mr. Speaker, the response of the Shadow Chancellor today just confirms what we already knew. This previous government was deluded, out of touch and grossly irresponsible. Today, we begin to fix the mess that they have created.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2010, we repeatedly heard the words that the Labour government didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. Isn't the case with the previous government? Not merely didn't they fix the roof, they actually destroyed the whole foundations of our public services. Could I, amongst the difficult decisions, just welcome 2 points that my right honourable friend made. One is the encouragement to work with local councils to increase the take-up of pension credits. That's something the Select Committee called for repeatedly in the last Parliament, and it wasn't taken up. That's really important. Secondly, in terms of multi-year settlements, could the Chancellor confirm it will be her intention as well to provide multi-year settlements ultimately for local councils? It's something they've been calling for repeatedly. It will be a welcome step to help them with a very difficult financial situation they're facing.
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for those questions. First of all, yes, I can confirm that we will be doing multi-year settlements with local authorities as well as with government departments. It's incredibly important that government departments and local authorities can plan for the future, knowing what money is available, rather than running down the clock towards the end of the year. I would like also to thank my honourable friend for welcoming the announcement I made today about working with local government to improve the take-up of pension credit. It is woeful that that take-up of pension credit is so low. It is vital that everybody gets the money that they're entitled to, especially pensioners, and that's why we've taken on those recommendations from elderly people's charities today to ensure that we work with local government to boost take-up of that benefit.
Lib Dem spokesperson Sarah Alday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for advance sight of her statement, and I'd like to associate myself with the expressions of gratitude towards our emergency services, and the thoughts of all Liberal Democrats were those affected by the incident in Southport. Years of Conservative chaos and mismanagement have left our economy on life support and in desperate need of emergency care, and things cannot go on like this any longer. We must now revive growth by getting people off NHS waiting lists and back into work. So we urge the government to invest wisely in GPs, dentists and hospitals to not only support patients, but also to improve efficiency within the NHS and deliver the growth so desperately needed after years of Conservative failure. Mr. Speaker, the outgoing Conservative government will go down in the history books as one of the most damaging administrations our country has seen, and today's statement has thrown that picture into even more stark relief. It wasn't just their catastrophic mini-budget. We saw a vicious cycle of stagnation and recession, driven by years of chaos and uncertainty. For the first time, living standards declined over the course of a parliament as people experienced the harshest cost of living crisis in generations. Our public services were abandoned, waiting lists soared, schools crumbled and our social care is in crisis. The dire state in which the Conservatives left our public finances is just indicative of their irresponsibility. People are painfully aware that Conservative chaos has real-life consequences. Interest rates were sent soaring and millions of people saw their mortgage payments increase by hundreds of pounds a month. That's why, more than ever, we need to foster economic stability, to draw a line under the uncertainty of the last few years. An important step in rebuilding confidence in our economy is to set up a long-term industrial strategy. It will help to unlock vital investment, create good jobs and help us tackle the climate emergency. So will the Chancellor reassure this House that the Government will start work on an industrial strategy as soon as practically possible? Mr. Speaker, we cannot talk about rebuilding our economy without talking about the crisis in health and social care. Millions have a long-term health condition, making them too ill to work, and millions more are stuck on NHS waiting lists. Many others can't leave hospital because there is no care provision. The Liberal Democrats have always understood that we cannot have a thriving economy and strong public finances until we fix the crisis in health and social care. And that's why we put forward detailed proposals to deliver more GPs, invest in dental services and cut ambulance waiting times. Equally, we must give people the good quality care they deserve, so we urge the Government to work across party lines to implement a system of free personal care and give our unpaid carers the proper support they need. The last Conservative administration left people with crippling care costs, and that is why it is urgent that we have cross-party talks on social care, and I urge the Government to begin those as soon as we possibly can. Investing in health and care isn't just about giving people the fair deal they deserve, it is also about sound management of our public finances. So will the Chancellor guarantee that the NHS and social care will be at the heart of her plans to address the Conservative Party's legacy of mismanagement? Part of that legacy is the previous government's promise to deliver 40 new hospitals. Postponed, redefined and never properly funded, this turned out to be yet another empty Conservative promise. But having listened to many colleagues on these benches over the last few years, there are clearly hospitals that are in dire need of investment. Crumbling roofs, buckets to catch the leaks. So will she meet with those members whose constituents will be affected by today's announcement to hear directly the situation in their particular hospitals? Lastly, Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the other side of the equation, securing the funding our public services so desperately need. Over the last Parliament, we saw the Conservative Party raise taxes on hard-working households again and again just to pay for its own mistakes. So will the Chancellor agree with me that it would be unfair to ask working people to pick up the tab a second time after they already suffered through years of painful tax rises. My party have set out detailed proposals to raise funding for our public services in a fair way. For example, by reversing the Conservatives' tax cuts for big banks, putting in place a proper windfall tax on oil and gas producers, and raising the digital services tax on social media giants. I urge the Chancellor to draw from these ideas, which could raise billions, by asking some of the largest companies in the world to pay their fair share. Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that our economy, our public services and our public finances have been left in a precarious position. Now the hard work must be done to repair the damage and return stability, growth and prosperity to our country. That is what the Liberal Democrats will always champion, and we sincerely hope that the government will look closely at our proposals to end the crisis in health and social care, grow our economy and give people a fair deal. Thank you.
The Exchequer.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution, and particularly the theme about helping people into work and fixing our National Health Service. I also totally agree with the Honourable Lady about the immense damage that the Tory mini-budget did, particularly in pushing up mortgage costs for so many of our constituents. The Honourable Lady asks about industrial strategy. My right honourable friend, the Business and Trade Secretary, will be setting out more details of the modern industrial strategy so we can work in partnership with business to exploit the big opportunities we have as a country and as an economy for growth and prosperity in all parts of the UK. The Honourable Lady asks about health and social care. The Honourable Lady is absolutely right to highlight the huge challenge of waiting lists, 7.6 million when the Conservatives left office. I welcome the deal to get the junior doctors back to work, and I'm sure the whole country will, because it will mean that people can actually get operations and treatment when they need. And after the cost last year to the NHS, to our economy, of £1.7 billion of industrial action and £1.4 million appointments missed, this would be welcome to people who are on those NHS waiting lists. And of course, we've made that commitment for 40,000 additional appointments every single week in the National Health Service in this government. And that's why we will crack down on tax avoidance and ensure that finally non-DOMs who make their home in Britain pay their fair share of tax here in Britain. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with constituents who are affected by the 40 hospital betrayal from the previous government, because we recognise, as the Honourable Lady says, the importance of ensuring that all of our constituents have the health services that they deserve. And I couldn't agree more with the Honourable Lady that it shouldn't be working people who pick up the tab of the Conservative Party failure. That is why I restated our commitment today not to increase taxes on working people, no income tax, national insurance increases or VAT. That is the commitment we campaigned on in this election, and I stand by that commitment.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend and the Labour government on such a strong start, but particularly on the emphasis on transparency and accountability for the hard-earned money of our tax-paying constituents. She highlighted that the Treasury will be asked to share with the Office for Budget Responsibility, Mr. Speaker, its assessment of immediate public spending pressures and wants to enshrine that rule in the Charter for Budget Responsibility. Will she also make sure that that is a public document reported to Parliament to maintain this vital transparency going forward?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for those questions, and I agree with her entirely, and she speaks from experience from the Public Accounts Committee. The Charter of Budget Responsibility will be published. We've already introduced legislation for the new fiscal lock that we set out in our manifesto, so that we can ensure that never again can a government do what the previous government did and overspend by £22 billion within 1 year.
Harriet Baldwin.
Mr. Speaker, what a chilling political choice to choose to take away the winter fuel allowance from a 90-year-old on an income of £10,000 a year. And that was a political choice. I want to ask the Chancellor more about productivity. She used the word once during her speech. What discussions has she had about improving productivity, which according to the Office for Budget Responsibility in the public sector is still 5% lower and has not recovered since the levels we enjoyed before the pandemic?
The challenge of productivity sits across both the public and private sector. In the last 14 years, productivity in the public and private sector has flatlined, and we need to boost both of those. We need to boost productivity in the public sector to ensure that we get better value for money for our public services, but we also need to improve productivity in our private sector so that we can improve living standards and have the money for our public services.
John Trickett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Chancellor's statement about public sector pay. But isn't it clear, though, that after savaging public services, holding down public sector pay, driving 3 million people into the food banks, that this crazy austerity ideological programme of the Tories failed massively, but at the same time, the richest 150 people in the country gained wealth of £500 billion. Can I tempt the Chancellor to say that we reject, though there are hard decisions to make, we accept, that we reject the ideological commitment to this form of Tory austerity?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I think that we do owe it to our armed forces, our prison officers, our police forces, our nurses and our teachers to reward them properly for the work that they do. And that's what we did today in implementing in full the recommendations of the pay review bodies. And I would also echo the views of my honourable friend that a return to austerity would be no way to run our economy. It resulted in growth hemorrhaging in the last Parliament and all the damage that did, both to living standards and money for public services.
Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor is like a dodgy car mechanic. She says she's done all the searches, she gives you a fixed price, you hand in your car keys, and then a few weeks later, she's found all these new problems. The price has doubled, but it's too late. You've given her your car, and you both know this was her plan all along. Trust and credibility are critical to a Chancellor. Why has she been so careless and so quick to throw hers away?
Chancellor.
If the right honourable gentleman has any chance of fixing the mess that his previous government has made, he might want to start with an apology.
Sam Carley.
Thank the Chancellor for her honesty on the incredibly serious situation that she's just outlined. Does the Chancellor agree with me that the above-inflation pay deals agreed by this government with our public sector staff will begin the process of rebuilding trust between them and our government and will benefit the public purse by reducing strike action?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and let's just be clear, the pay recommendations today are in line with private sector pay. Yep. So these are just the pay deals that were received by the majority of workers in the private sector. But my honourable friend is right that we do owe a debt of gratitude to our frontline workers who got us through the pandemic and so many other challenges over the last few years, and they deserve to be paid properly for the work they do.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the recent election campaign, we in the SNP repeatedly warned about an 18 billion hole in the Labour Party's spending plans. Now that you've confirmed that today, Chancellor, will you apologise to those voters in Scotland who supported the Labour Party leader in Scotland when he said, "Read my lips, no austerity"? And will you also reverse the 9% cut in Scotland's capital allocation, please?
Chancellor.
I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman was actually paying attention. The £22 billion black hole is this year. The Institute of Fiscal Studies was warning about a black hole over the lifetime of the Parliament of £18 billion. No, those are two very different things, and both of them can be true. What we are showing today is an in-year gap of £22 billion that the honourable gentleman didn't know about, no one on this side of the House knew about, the OBR did not know about, and the country did not know about. This is new information that is being published today, above and beyond what anyone knew when we were campaigning in the election.
Dr. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And frankly, the response of the Conservatives opposite leaves something to be believed. 14 years of stripping the engine of this country's economy to such an extent their response is simply taking the pistons. Come on. But I am so proud that we now have a Chancellor in place who is not
penny wise but pound foolish, but conscious that our constituents are all going to have to pick up the pieces as a result of those 14 years. Can she tell us a little bit more about her audit and what it has identified about the money that was wasted by the previous government by their approach to mismanaging capital projects? We now know, for example, the failure to rebuild Whipps Cross Hospital has already cost us an extra £50 million in the last few years alone. Our constituents will pay the price of this government for many years to come. This new Labour government needs to be honest with them. Can she tell us just how much money, sorry seems to be the hardest word for them to say, is costing us?
Chancellor.
Well, what this country are owed is a £22 billion apology by the party opposite. And my honourable friend is right to point out the overspends in this Parliament, including on the hospital programme. A £4 billion gap in the budget between what was announced and what was needed for those hospitals. £6.4 billion overspend in the asylum system, all unfunded and all undisclosed until I have done so today.
Mark Francis.
Thank you, sir. On defence, I welcome the affirmation of the funding for Ukraine, which I presume was already fully allocated in the Treasury Reserve in the usual way. On the mainstream defence budget, she's announced that all departmental spending will now be reviewed every 2 years. At the speed at which Whitehall works, that means the minute they finish one review, they'll be into the staff work for the next. So all public spending, particular capital spending, will effectively be under permanent review. This won't work. How can we commit to 10-year defence programmes like the vital new Tempest fighter if every 2 years all departmental budgets are up in the air?
Just two things on those questions. First of all, there is a reserve. It was £9 billion for departmental expenditure. It was spent 3 times over before I arrived in the Treasury. That is why we're in the problems that we are today. On the issue of capital expenditure, yes, we fully intend to set longer-term budgets for capital expenditure, but we will do 3-year spending reviews every 2 years for departmental expenditure, day-to-day expenditure. That's really important to give certainty to government departments so they can plan for the future. We're in a position today where no department, no local authority knows its budget beyond next March. That is no position to put government departments in, including the Ministry of Defence.
Debbie Abrahams. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today, particularly in regard to the public sector pay award. But I wonder if she could share a little bit more in terms of how the appalling economic conditions that we now face, how should we incorporate equity in her decisions about how we're going to address this in-year deficit?
Salah. I thank my honourable friend for that question. I've got to be honest, the decisions that I've made today are tough decisions. They're not the decisions that I wanted to make. They're not the decisions I expected to make. But given the seriousness of the inheritance that I face, they are the right decisions in those circumstances, the responsible decisions in those circumstances, and the fairest decisions that I could make with these circumstances.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Under the Conservatives, the new hospital programme legacy is completely dire, but the Chancellor will know that there is also a cost to delay. We have life-expired buildings that will need to continue to be patched up before they are replaced. So could I urge the Chancellor, as I urged her colleague, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care last week, to give the go-ahead to those projects that are ready to go but are currently living with life-expired buildings? And will she review the outdated rules to allow hospitals to spend some more of their own capital funds to help with repairs and rebuilds?
Chancellor.
I thank the honourable lady for that question, and I welcome the Deputy Speaker to her place. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with people affected. In Leeds, we were promised a new hospital that has never been built, so I do understand the concerns the honourable and right honourable members have about this hospital programme. But we are in a situation where there's a £22 billion in-year overspend. That means incredibly difficult decisions. These are not the decisions that we want to make, but they're responsible ones in the circumstances, given the dire inheritance that we face from the party opposite.
Jeevan Sander.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. work in the Treasury, what we've heard today about the party opposite is shocking and it's shameful. Can I also say the Chancellor today set out how far away the last government was from meeting their own targets on hospital building? Will the Chancellor agree with me that our plan, by contrast, represents a deliverable way to make sure that we get waiting lists down?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he's very welcome on these benches with his expertise. Everything in our manifesto was fully costed and fully funded. 40,000 additional appointments every single week in the NHS, funded by cracking down on tax avoidance and ensuring that if you make your home in Britain, you should pay your taxes here, which is why we will finally deal with a terrible situation where non-DOMs could claim they didn't live in Britain for tax purposes despite making their homes here. Those people should contribute to the public purse, and under Labour, they will.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Congratulations on your election, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can't hope to match the splendid double entendre of the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow, but may I say to the Chancellor that one effect of being here a long time is a realisation that no one party has a monopoly of wisdom. Is she willing at least to concede, given the impartial assessment by the House of Commons Library that COVID cost this country between 310 and 410 billion pounds, that the previous government did a pretty good job in getting inflation down to 2% less than 2 years after the pandemic?
The pandemic is no excuse for making unfunded spending commitments, and that is precisely what the government did. And given that the honourable gentleman mentioned the pandemic, during the pandemic, the party opposite handed out contracts to friends and donors of their party in a VIP lane, which is why we are appointing a COVID corruption commissioner, because we want that money back in our public services where it belongs.
Bill Esterson.
Well, welcome to your place, Madam Deputy Speaker. It wasn't just the public finances which the party opposite mismanaged over 14 years. They failed to support industry too. And just the figures today demonstrate this point. Britain has dropped out of the top 10 countries for manufacturing for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. So I very much welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to leverage in billions more in private investment to make up for the record low levels of private investment that we saw under the party opposite. And does she agree with me that these latest manufacturing figures just show how critical it is that government works closely with business and the trade unions on a long-term industrial strategy?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. And I too saw those numbers today that showed that Britain was out of the top 10 of manufacturing countries, which is shameful given our history and being at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. I'd also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for the work that he's done in ensuring that Labour went into this election as the most pro-business party at this election. The reforms that we've already announced in the first 3 weeks, planning reforms, the creation of a national wealth fund, reform of our pension system and a modern industrial strategy, are how we will go about making Britain the best place to start and grow a business and the best place to invest. And we look forward to holding our International Investment Summit in the UK later this year.
Adrian Ramsey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have sympathy for the issues that the Chancellor is seeking to address, but the solutions she set out today are focused on spending cuts. Please could she say more about how she is also looking at opportunities to bring in revenue to the Exchequer so that we can see the investment that's needed, whether that's in new hospitals or whether that's in investing in our railways. In particular, we do need new hospitals. We have hospitals that are crumbling around the country, as we all know. We need to invest in our railways. We have people stuck in traffic jams and struggling with high rail fares. So in particular, has the Chancellor looked at the potential to introduce a wealth tax, a tax on the very wealthiest in society, people with wealth and assets over 10 million, which could raise tens of billions during this Parliament? Has the Chancellor considered proposals like this, which would address the fact that we have growing billionaire wealth, but ordinary people are suffering from these cuts?
Chancellor, thank you.
Thank the honourable gentleman for that question. I just set out the non-dom tax loophole closures, and my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, has published a written ministerial statement today setting out the manifesto commitments we made around the energy profits levy, VAT on private schools, as well as the non-dom changes which we will be consulting on and introducing at the budget. But we will not be introducing a wealth tax. We want this to be a great place for investors to come, and a wealth tax would have the opposite effect.
Claire Hazelgrove.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I thank my right honourable friend for her transparency and openness about the dire state of our inheritance from the Conservatives. Now, with the Tory leadership race now clearly in full swing, which is important, people across the Filton and Bradley Stoke constituency and across the country deserve to know. Why is it that none of the contenders came clean about this black hole when they were in government? Or were they kept in the dark by the Chancellor's predecessor as well?
Well, it's far from me to give advice to Tory leadership contestants, but if I was taking part in this contest, I would want to distance myself as much as possible from the government in the previous Parliament that caused this terrible mess.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor committed to long-term planning for capital expenditure. Last March, the then Chancellor committed £20 billion to carbon capture, utilisation and storage, without which a net zero future cannot be delivered. Can she set out to the House today, in light of her review, what commitment this government will make to investment, including that £20 billion, into carbon capture, utilisation and storage?
Councillor.
Well, we've already created a national wealth fund which will leverage in billions of pounds private sector investment, including into carbon capture and storage, as well as green hydrogen and renewable ready ports. But we'll be setting out all of our spending in the spending review later this year.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your appointment. It also feels really good to be back on this side of the House. Chancellor, the annual accounts for the Department of Health and Social Department showed that there was a £9.9 billion spent on PPE has been written off. Does the Chancellor agree that we could claw back this money through the COVID Corruption Commissioner? And we could possibly use some of that money to eradicate child poverty?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. It is a source of huge shame that the previous government wears for spending billions of pounds of taxpayers' money on contracts in a VIP lane and on PPE that was never used, and in some cases has literally gone up in smoke and been burnt. That's why we are appointing a COVID Corruption Commissioner, because that money belongs not in the pockets of Tory donors, but in our public services, and we will do everything within our powers to get that money back.
Ben Obsijekti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week, the Health Secretary stated that hospitals with reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete are at the top of my list of priorities. If the new hospitals programme is delayed via review, that means along with it will be the rebuild of the 5 RAC hospitals, not part of the 40 referenced. Without avoiding the question with a soundbite, what reassurances can the Chancellor give that we will break ground on any of the new RAC replacement hospitals, and specifically Hinchinbrook Hospital in my constituency of Huntingdon, during this Parliament?
Chancellor.
Well, the honourable gentleman should blame the previous government for not funding commitments that they made. But my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet all people affected, including those affected by hospitals with RAC problems, as soon as possible, because we recognise, I personally recognise as a Leeds MP, the importance of new hospitals and ensuring that our hospital estate is fit for purpose. But we cannot spend money that we don't have.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Chancellor said the books were open and the Office for Budget Responsibility had audited the government's figures shortly before the election. However, the chair of the OBR has today published a letter confirming he intends to launch a review into the preparation of the March forecasts, and that we were made aware of the extent of these pressures at a meeting with the Treasury only last week. Perhaps the Chancellor, perhaps I'm only new here, Madam Deputy Speaker, can inform me how to get the Shadow Chancellor to correct the record.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The OBR have just published a letter where, as my honourable friend said, that letter says, "We were made aware of the extent of these pressures at a meeting with the Treasury last week." He goes on to say, if a significant fraction of these pressures is ultimately accommodated through higher DEL spending in 24-25, this would constitute one of the largest year-ahead overspends against DEL forecasts outside the pandemic years. This is incredibly serious, and it's why today I came to this House to set out the £22 billion overspend compared with what the government set out at its previous budget. I think that this letter from the Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility can leave no one in this chamber under any doubt about the seriousness of the situation.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. And can I thank the Chancellor for her candour and her clarity today. There will be many residents and patients at Frimley Park Hospital in my constituency today who are surrounded by a forest of acroprops holding up rack-riddled roofs, who will be deeply anxious at the Chancellor's announcement today. Can she recommit herself to the Secretary of State for Health's commitment last week to prioritise spending, where possible, on those rack-affected hospitals? And to bring some comfort and clarity to the patients and indeed the staff at Frimley Park Hospital. Thank you very much.
Chancellor.
I fully understand the concerns of the right honourable gentleman, and I know that during the election campaign, like so many members across the House, he would have campaigned in good faith, believing that the money was there. I can say in all candour today, the money was not there for this hospital programme, and I apologise, although it's not my apology to make, on behalf of the party opposite, for the state of the public finances that they have left for us to sort out. But my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with you and everybody affected by this so that we can do whatever we can to make sure that we can get these hospitals in the condition that your constituents, and so many of our constituents, rightly expect.
Polly Billington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Chancellor confirm that despite the Conservatives' failure to set aside money for their transport commitments, Labour's plan to modernise our transport network, vital for my community in East Thanet, will deliver a unified rail system, which means we can deliver more for passengers and for local communities?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. And we had to make difficult decisions today to cancel road and rail infrastructure projects. These aren't decisions that we wanted to make, but if the money isn't there, we can't go ahead with these projects. It's as simple as that. The money has got to be there. The sums have always got to add up, because I will not make the mistakes of the previous government and of Liz Truss in crashing the economy, sending interest rates and mortgage rates spiralling for our constituents. That's why I've had to take the action that I've taken today, to get a grip on public spending, to get a grip on public finances. I make no apology for that, but I do recognise the damage that it does to so many constituents with projects that they had expected to be happening.
Sir Desmond Swain.
When her legislation enables illegal entrants to leave their current accommodation, where will they go?
Chancellor.
Well, under the previous government, no applications were being processed, and so nobody was being sent home. We will process those applications, and we will send people who have no right to be here back home.
Fred Thomas. Apologies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for her excellent statement, putting public finances and public services back on their feet. Does she agree, however, with me that after seeing how extensive this Tory cover-up has been, with unfunded commitments in multiple departments, it's not just her predecessor as Chancellor, but every member of the last cabinet that is complicit in this cover-up?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I don't believe that there's any member of the previous cabinet who could not have been aware about the scale of this cover-up and the scale of this overspending. They should hang their heads in shame, and instead of coming to this chamber today and issuing platitudes, they should have done the right thing and apologised to the country.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor this afternoon has made two key political decisions. One, to fund extraordinarily high public sector pay increases, and two, to clobber pensioners to pay for it. So can she explain to this House and every pensioner that will lose their winter fuel allowance in the process
why it was she didn't challenge the Bank of England on the taxpayer bailouts they require to the tune of tens of billions of pounds to cover their losses from bond sales.
Thank the honourable gentleman for that question. First of all, on the pay review bodies, it's an extraordinary omission that the previous government did not set affordability criteria for the independent pay review bodies, which meant that they were able to come back with these recommendations. And it would be almost without precedent that we wouldn't accept recommendations from an independent pay review body. And if he wants to go to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, those in the armed forces in his constituency, and say that they don't deserve a pay increase in line with private sector wages, then that's up to him to say. But I do believe that those public sector workers deserve those pay increases. On pensions and the winter fuel payment, this is not the decision I wanted to make. It's not the decision I expected to make. But we had to make in-year savings, which is incredibly difficult to do. But without doing that, we would put in our public finances at risk. We are ensuring that everybody who's entitled to pension credit, the poorest pensioners, continue to get the winter fuel payment. And indeed, we will work with the Department for Work and Pensions, with local authorities and with charities to boost the take-up of pension credit.
Rachel Maskell. Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome to your place. Can I thank my right honourable friend for her forensic approach to looking at the nation's finances. As she digs deeper, she will see that York, the city I represent, is at the bottom of many of the matrix for the funding formulas. Will she, by the budget, look at the funding formulas so we can see the distribution of funding? The last government handed out for pet projects much of the money that she is trying to get control of now, but will she look at how that's distributed across the country too?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I know particularly around flood defences, there are many great needs in the constituency of York that she represents. These decisions, though, will all be made at the time of the spending review.
Josh Babarindi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Residents of Eastbourne will be outraged to learn that the Conservatives' promise of a brand new hospital for our town was not worth the paper it was written on. Eastbourne deserves better. Now, underinvestment has consequences, and at the moment, Eastbourne District General Hospital is closed for births due to this underinvestment, and it has been since December. It needs investment, so will the Chancellor confirm that her government will invest in midwives, doctors and nurses, as well as hospital buildings, to protect local services there and across the country?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question, and I can see on behalf of his constituents the frustration and anger that he feels that the previous government have let his constituents so badly down by not funding these hospitals that they promised. I can commit that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with everybody affected by this, but we have also got a workforce plan to invest in the future workforce in our National Health Service, as well as today announcing that we are accepting in full the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies to pay our doctors, nurses and others who work in our NHS properly.
Torsten Bell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your new post. There can be reasonable political debates across this House about the total levels of public spending. There was lots of that in the last election with us calling for higher levels of public investment, but there should be complete agreement across this House about the need for the Treasury to ensure public spending is well spent. And top is that is making sure that policies and commitments of every department match the budgets of those departments. And what you can hear from experts right around the country today is that they do not match those budgets. So can the Chancellor reassure this ex-Treasury official, this House and my constituents in Swansea that this will never happen under this Labour government?
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that question and welcome him to his place in this House, and he speaks powerfully based on his previous experience. I will fix the mess that we have inherited, but it is a terrible mess, a £22 billion in-year gap between what was forecast to be spent and what was actually being spent by the previous government. We will get a grip on our public finances. That requires tough choices, but that is the role of Chancellor and that is the role of government. These are choices that the previous government ducked and diverted. but we will make the difficult decisions to get our public finances back on a firmer footing.
Now we could do with some masterclasses in short questions and short answers. Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor quoted Paul Johnson earlier of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but she actually omitted the end of his comments. He said, half the spending hole, she claims, is public sector pay, over which the government made a choice. That's the truth, isn't it? She does a good shocked face, but she chose to do this, to create her own spending hole, didn't she?
Well done. But it was the previous government that set the mandate for the pay review bodies, and it is extraordinary that they didn't include in that remit a measure of affordability, but they didn't, which is why the pay review bodies made these recommendations. The previous Education Secretary could have rejected these recommendations, but she let it sit on her desk because the previous government were not willing to make tough decisions. We've made those decisions, including making sure that a third of the cost of these pay awards is absorbed, but there's a cost to inaction, £1.7 billion cost to the NHS alone last year because of industrial action.
Derek Twigg.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Chancellor, I'll say to the Chancellor, we do know under the previous government that there was at least a 17 billion black hole in defence, and of course it hollowed out the armed forces. But can I ask her, what is a surprise today is that we find out that there was not enough money set aside in reserve to fund all the military assistance needed for Ukraine. Could you say a bit more about that?
I think the problem that the previous government got into is that every time they wanted to make a commitment, they said it would be paid for from the reserve. The problem is that by the time I came into the Treasury on the 5th of July, that reserve had been spent 3 times over, because they put so many commitments into that reserve that they couldn't afford them. That is the situation that we inherited. That's where the £22 billion black hole comes from, and that's why I'm having to make difficult decisions today to get a grip on the public finances.
Paul Holmes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor spent the election campaign saying she was going for growth through investing in infrastructure, but instead she's cutting it and now funding inflation-busting pay deals and scrapping pension benefits for the worst off. Does she agree that in the battle for the two faces of the Labour Party, the face of tax rises, borrowing and boom and bust won, and the British people, ultimately hard-working people, will lose under her leadership?
There's nothing pro-growth about making unfunded spending commitments. There's nothing pro-growth about a lack of respect for taxpayers' money. On the issue of pension credit and the winter fuel payment, we will continue to provide winter fuel payment for the poorest pensioners, those in receipt of pension credit.
Gregor Poynton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Chancellor for her statement today and being straight with the public about the state of our finances. I know my constituents in the Livingston constituency want a government that tells it to them straight. Will she agree with me that ducking tough decisions and hiding bad news, as the party opposite has done, is just a way to make a bad situation even worse?
The previous government and the previous Chancellor should hang their heads in shame of the inheritance that they have left for this government to fix. But I will fix this mess. I will put our public finances and our public spending on a firmer footing. That is the responsible thing to do, and that is what I will do.
Pete Wishart.
Welcome to the chair, Madam Deputy Speaker. Everybody in their granny knew that there would be a multi-billion-pound black hole. Only the Chancellor seemed to be deaf and blind to the situation, but we knew she was going to be here explaining the sheer scale of it. When we raised this during the election campaign, we were told we were being misleading, that this was all mince. Well, we know now. And isn't it the case that cutting winter fuel payments to all pensioners seems and feels like Tory austerity? And what discussions has she had? What discussions has she had with the Scottish Government? Because she will know, obviously, that this is a devolved responsibility. Hear, hear.
My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, briefed the Scottish Government today on these decisions. These are decisions that are necessary, and it is not in the interests of the Scottish people to have unfunded commitments and put our public finances and our reputation for economic stability at risk. These are not easy decisions, these are difficult decisions, but the fault of these decisions lies with the previous government. And to claim that this is austerity today, when we have just given a pay rise to more than 2 million public sector workers, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Katie White.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend for her clarity and candour. After 14 years of sluggish growth, low living standards and then a cost of living crisis, How callous is it that the Tories went into the election asking for another 5 years of power with a manifesto of false hope, undeliverable promises, with no mentions of the numerous black holes she's now uncovered? What will the Chancellor do to instead offer my constituents of Leeds North West some real hope?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and very pleased to have her as a constituency neighbour in Leeds. The honourable friend is absolutely right. The government went into the election, the previous government went into the election knowing that there was a £22 billion black hole. And what did they do during that election? They made more unfunded spending commitments. They made more unfunded promises about tax that they knew they could not keep. That is deeply irresponsible. And after all the damage they've done, they should have come to this chamber today and apologised.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would the Chancellor confirm that all of the information presented today was not known to her before last Thursday when the estimates were laid? Thank you.
When I arrived at the Treasury 3 weeks ago, I asked Treasury officials to do a full analysis. We concluded that analysis over this weekend, and I am publishing it today to this House of Commons.
Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Chancellor for this urgent update today. With living standards now worse than they were when they took office, people across this country continue to suffer the consequences of broken promises and mismanagement from the previous government. But this final fiscal mic drop truly is shocking. Does the Chancellor agree that, in contrast to the unfunded fantasy promises put forward by the party opposite, Labour's manifesto showed cast iron discipline and in being fully costed?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. Everything in Labour's manifesto was fully costed and fully funded. We now know that on top of the £22 billion black hole that the previous government left, they made unfunded commitments during the election. That was deeply irresponsible, and the country were right to reject them.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Chancellor think that one of her first decisions to cancel infrastructure projects is consistent with her desire to grow the economy?
There's nothing pro-growth about making commitments that you cannot afford. There is nothing pro-growth about having £22 billion of unfunded commitments. We saw that when Liz Truss did her mini-budget less than 2 years ago. And right honourable and honourable members on the benches opposite would do well to learn that lesson.
Clive Lewis.
Excuse me. Oh, sorry, thank you. And welcome to your place, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, probably won't be too surprised to hear that when it comes to wasteful and expensive vanity projects, the party opposite hasn't confined itself to national matters. Conservative-run Norfolk County Council was attempting to push through a £300 million vanity road known as the Norwich Western Link. That's 3.9 kilometres of road at a cost of more than £70 million a kilometre. So will she take a look at this environmental and financial disaster and work with those of us who know there are more cost-effective and ecologically sound alternatives?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue, and I will ask my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, to meet with him to discuss them further.
Ben Lake.
The Chancellor's clarity on the state of the public finances, and indeed for confirming that the government will be accepting the recommendations of the independent peer review bodies. She explained that doing so incurs an additional in-year cost of some £9 billion, and the department will be tasked with savings of up to £3 billion. Can she outline whether she anticipates they'll have to cover the entire cost of the peer review recommendations, or does she anticipate the Treasury will need to make available additional funds to make up the shortfall?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. We have asked departments to absorb £3.2 billion worth of the pressures. That will be different based on different departments. We know that in health and education, for example, it will be harder to absorb those pay pressures given the huge challenges that health and education face. So it will be different by different departments, and we will be setting that out in the written ministerial statements from the relevant Secretaries of State.
Dr Zubair Ahmed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend, the Chancellor, for coming to this House and outlining the difficult decisions that she has had to take on behalf of us all. Decisions she would not have had to take were it not for the opaque fiscal negligence of the party opposite. Can she reassure me that a Labour government will always protect the vulnerable, and that under a Labour government, pensioners in this country will still be over £1,600 better off per year by the end of this Parliament?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and we were determined to protect the most vulnerable, which is why we made the decision to ensure that winter fuel payment would still be paid to the poorest pensioners on pension credit. But more than that, we will work with local government and with charities to increase the take-up of pension credit so that everybody who deserves the pension credit gets it, and with it, the winter fuel payment.
Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all remember Gordon Brown's raid on pensions, and it has taken just 3 weeks for Labour to revert to type, and it is pensioners who are suffering most. Martin Lewis has already criticised the decision online. However, when it comes to these estimates, the Honourable Lady cannot claim that when permanent secretaries were signing off these estimates over the weekend, I assume, that they didn't know about these supposed holes. So if so, and they did sign them off with holes in it, it'd be a breach of their legal duties. So will she be investigating them, or will she be apologising to them for throwing them under the bus today?
Instead of blaming civil servants, the Honourable Lady should blame the people who are really responsible, and that is the previous government. The country did the right thing, kicking them out 3 weeks ago. They never deserve to get their hands on power again.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. During the last Parliament, the government paid substantial amounts to the train operating companies to make good the losses during a prolonged period of industrial dispute, causing mayhem, causing chaos to the general public. At the same time, the train operating companies paid huge dividends. They also paid the executives massive increases in bonuses. Can my right honourable friend say how much this actually cost the British taxpayer, and can she ensure that this never, ever, ever happens again?
Yes, on page 5 of the Fixing the Foundation documents that we published today, it sets out the pressures on public spending on rail services, pressures that have emerged on rail finances, primarily due to weaker than expected recovery in passenger demand, as well as the cost of industrial action, has led to a pressure of £1.6 billion in this financial year alone.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, and I'd also like to welcome Madam Deputy Speaker to her chair. Much of what the Chancellor says I welcome. No fresh income tax, national insurance, the VAT. But I'm sure the Chancellor will recognise the concern that many pensioners, particularly in the coldest areas of the country, will be feeling at her announcement of the withdrawal of winter fuel payments. And although she's saying that she will work on, bringing more people forward, encouraging people to sign up for credits, can she tell us how she's going to do that if she's also going to cut the government communications budget?
Well, thank the Honourable Lady for that question. There's a couple of things that we're committed to do. First of all, a pension credit and housing benefit are due to be amalgamated. The previous government put that back. We will bring that forward, and we know that take-up of pension credit will increase when it is merged with housing benefit. That will make an impact in terms of ensuring that people get the money that they are entitled to. But we've also committed, as elderly people's charities have asked, for central government to work with local government to better identify people who are entitled to pension credit but aren't today claiming it. We want to make sure that everyone who's entitled to pension credit gets it, and with it the associated winter fuel payment.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask my honourable friend, the Chancellor, if she agrees with me that one of the key failures of the previous Conservative government over the last 14 years was their failure to grow the economy? And does she agree with me that it's that lack of growth which meant that their government simply did not have the money to do the things which they nonetheless committed to voters in this country to do, and therefore why we should take no lessons on trust and credibility from the party opposite?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. If our economy had have grown at just the average rate of the OECD economies these last 14 years, our economy today would be worth £140 billion more. That would be worth £5,000 for every family in Britain, and would mean an additional £58 billion for our public services without increasing a single penny in tax. That shows how important economic growth is, which is why getting our economy growing is the #1 mission of this government.
David Simmons.
Well, thank you, and welcome to your place, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Estimates Day provisions which were presented by the Chancellor of the House last week included a capital departmental expenditure limit of £12.655 billion in the Department of Health and Social Care, which we know included the funds for the new Hillingdon Hospital, which was granted planning permission and where work's already started. So can I ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer, does she stand by what she told the House in the Estimates Day debate, and on which we all relied when casting our vote? And can she therefore assure my constituents that that hospital project, which was fully budgeted for and where work has already started, will be delivered by this government?
As the honourable gentleman knows, you have to publish estimates to be able to ensure that government funding continues. So we had to publish those main estimates, but we will be presenting new estimates to the House based on the revelations that we have set out today.
Were they accurate?
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I express the anger that many of my constituents will be feeling, not just about the economic mismanagement and litany of broken promises of the party opposite, but the complete failure to be transparent, both with them and the British public at large? And can I ask the Chancellor what she has to say to the party opposite about the way they behaved in office?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question, and we've been now in the chamber for 1 hour and 40 minutes, and we have not had a single apology from any member on the benches opposite. They should have come to the chamber today and apologised. They have not done that. The country kicked them out of office 3.5 weeks ago, and we can tell why.
Lucy Rigby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I point out to certain members in the parties opposite who might question the difficult decision the Chancellor has taken to restrict the winter fuel payment to those on pension credit? This has been put forward by the Conservatives and the Lib Dems in recent manifestos, and the Scottish Government's own anti-poverty advisory body has stated that the instrument as it stands, and I quote, is extraordinarily poorly targeted as regards addressing poverty. So does the Chancellor agree that whilst difficult, this decision is a sensible step towards fixing the huge Tory black hole in our public finances?
I thank my honourable friends for that question. None of the decisions that we've made today were easy. None of them were decisions that I wanted to have to make. But leaving unaddressed a £22 billion in-year hole in our public finances was not an option. We saw what happened when a previous Prime Minister and Chancellor played fast and loose with the public finances. I will not do that, which is why today I've been honest with this House about the scale of the inheritance we now have to deal with and the necessary decisions, including on winter fuel payment, that I've had to take today.
Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Richard Mitchell, the Chief Executive of Leicester Hospitals, has emailed me only a few days ago asking for a meeting about the new hospitals programme. Now, putting aside the politics to this, would she help arrange a meeting with Labour and Conservative MPs of Leicester and Leicestershire to discuss this matter alongside the Chief Executive of Leicestershire Hospitals?
I thank the honourable gentleman for asking that question, and my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, has agreed to meet with all MPs affected, and of course he will also be talking to people who run our health service to make sure that we can put right the mistakes made by the previous government.
Anna Sabine.
Madam Deputy Speaker, constituencies across the South West, including my own, have waited years for final confirmation of plans to improve the A303 with a tunnel, a vital piece of infrastructure for our local communities and our regional economy. We now learn that due to mismanagement of public finances by the previous government, those plans are under severe threat. This is a hammer blow to our constituents who have waited so long. Will the Chancellor meet with me, with my regional Lib Dem colleagues and with the local communities who will be affected by this news?
I thank the honourable lady for that question, and I understand her frustration and anger on behalf of her constituents that today we had to be honest about the scale of the inheritance we face. There was no money allocated for the A303 by the previous government, despite them saying it was going ahead. That is the state of affairs that we inherited, and I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, would be happy to meet with you and colleagues to discuss this matter.
Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for outlining the Conservative cover-up this afternoon, for which they should apologise. One of the more shocking things to hear this afternoon is the repeated, constant criticism at the idea of paying public sector workers properly. Can I ask my right honourable friend, with the election of a Labour government, that the days of scapegoating public sector workers on public finances are over?
Yes.
Yeah. I know how hard teachers, doctors, nurses, our armed forces, our police officers and prison guards work to keep us all safe, healthy and educated. They deserve the pay awards that we've announced today. And it was the independent pay review bodies that recommended those pay increases. It would be extraordinary not to honour those, and we have honoured them today.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome you to the Chair. Madam Deputy Speaker, during the general election campaign, the now new Health Secretary and the local Labour Party in Keighley and Ilkley told my constituents that they were fully committed to delivering the full rebuild of Airedale Hospital in my constituency, one of those hospitals which struggles with aerated concrete, following my efforts to secure the full funds. With millions of pounds now being spent on the project and works well underway, can I seek reassurance from the Chancellor that this new Labour government will not deny my constituents their right for a full new rebuild of the Airedale Hospital?
The honourable gentleman say he has secured the funds. He did not secure the funds. The money was not there, which is why I'm having to make this statement today. I share his frustration and anger, but that frustration and anger should be with the previous government who did not fund these schemes.
Jake Richards.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents will be really concerned about the revelations that the Chancellor has set out to the House this afternoon. Particularly shocking, and I'm reading from her statement, is that the projected overspend on the asylum system, including their failed Rwanda plan, for this year alone will cost more than £6.4 billion.
Shocking.
Does my right honourable friend agree that instead of chuntering and shouting, a period of reflection would be best serve the Conservative Party and an apology to the country that they've let down?
My honourable friend is right that the people of Rother Valley will be shocked and appalled by the gross mismanagement of public finances, including the £6.4 billion overspend on asylum. That is why we are getting a grip of the public finances and public spending to put them on a firmer footing.
Kit Malthouse.
Congratulations on your ascension, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady said she's very keen on transparency. Could she just confirm to the House that she did have extensive access talks with senior civil servants in the Treasury in the run-up to the general election? And it might be helpful for transparency purposes if she could lay the minutes of those meetings in the House of Commons for the rest of the House to understand. But I'm also very concerned about this issue of misleading estimates being laid before the House. Could I suggest that for the elucidation of members, that she ask the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury and the Permanent Secretaries of those departments that are impacted by the decisions she's made today to confirm to the House in writing that none of the information that should have been in the estimates, or if they were correct, was included, so that we can see for ourselves whether she's covering up.
That's right.
The cover-up was from the benches opposite, and the sooner we get an apology, the better. An apology to the British people.
Deirdre Costigan.
Answer the question.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While the headline figures that the Chancellor has revealed are astonishing from an economic perspective, does the Chancellor agree with me that it is important to remember the impact of Conservative mismanagement on our public services, on our NHS, on our education system and on our national security? Indeed, I ask her, how can the Conservatives be trusted to run our economy or our public services ever again?
Well, the response today from former Conservative ministers just shows how deluded and out of touch they were. The British people delivered their verdict 3 weeks ago, and after the evidence that they've seen today, they will understand that things are even worse than they had thought.
Clive Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome to your place. Can I wish the Chancellor well in reversing years of economic mismanagement by the previous government? I really do welcome the commitment to speak to MPs who are affected by this failure to provide 40 new hospitals. These were promised 4.5 years ago. Patients and, just as importantly, staff at these hospitals will have been waiting for a long, long time. Will the Chancellor will the Chancellor make sure that there is a decision very soon so that we do not have to wait another 4.5 years for the staff and the patients to know what is happening with their hospital?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I share his frustration, anger and disappointment that the promises that were made by the previous government are now turned out to be built on sand. The money simply wasn't there. The decisions that we're having to take today are not easy decisions. They're not the decisions that I want to make, but we have to put our public finances on a firmer footing. That is essential. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with the honourable member and others affected by this as soon as possible to talk through what the next steps will be to make sure that all of our constituents have the public services, including the hospitals, that we rightly deserve.
Oliver Ryan.
Madam Deputy Speaker. The brass neck of the benches opposite is astonishing. It's astonishing after what we've heard from the Chancellor today. The residents that I have in Burnley, Padiham and Briarfield will be so disappointed to hear of what she's uncovered in the Treasury. This mismanagement that we've heard over the last 14 years, it was to be expected anyway. Does she agree with me that the now Shadow Chancellor should apologise, and if he won't do that, he should resign?
I do find it staggering that it's now almost 2 hours in this chamber and not a single member on the benches opposite have apologised for the state that they have left our public finances and our public services in. It's fallen on this new government to address these challenges. We will rise to that challenge, but it never should have been left in this state.
Saki Batty.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome you to your seat. The Chancellor spoke about the need to lay the estimate. Obviously really important, but the legal duty is not just to lay it, but also for it to be accurate. And the Chancellor, she's right, we've been here for nearly 2 hours. We haven't got an answer to this question. What did she know? When did she know it? Did she know any of the information that she's laid today before the estimates were laid? Please answer the question.
I've done more in 3.5 weeks to get a grip of our public finances than the previous government did in 14 years. I have worked these last 3.5 weeks to get a grip of the public finances and to understand the true extent of the scale of the challenge. We pulled this together over the last 3 weeks, and this weekend we were able to produce this document that's showing the £22 billion gap between what the previous government was spending and what they had budgeted for.
Lee Ingham.
It's clear now that even the OBR, whose express purpose is to provide independent analysis of the public finances, was simply not told about the black hole in Conservative spending plans. What will this Chancellor do differently to ensure we never end up in such a position again?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. And in the letter from the Office for Budget Responsibility that they published this afternoon, the Chair says, I welcome the important actions announced today by HM Treasury to improve the transparency and credibility of their institutional arrangements for forecasting, planning and controlling departmental expenditure limits. That is really important because by taking this action, we will ensure that never again could any government do what the party opposite did and cause a £22 billion black hole in our public finances.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The residents in my constituency of Farnham and Borden will be very concerned to hear about the scrapping of the new hospitals programme, especially those living in the north of the constituency who are served by Frimley Park Hospital. Can she confirm that the RAC-affected hospitals like Frimley Park will still go ahead, and will she tell us when we can have assurance on that so that we can reassure our constituents?
Well, the honourable gentleman's constituents will be rightly angry with the previous government for making unfunded spending commitments that they knew they could not pay for. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with all of those with affected hospitals, included where those hospitals have been affected by RAC, to make sure that we can, as quickly as possible, address the challenges that his constituents and so many other constituents now face because of the unfunded promises made by the previous government.
Michael Payne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I congratulate you on your election. And can I thank the Chancellor for demonstrating today that she will always put country first and party second. The Conservative Party's response to their own failures, Madam Deputy Speaker, is always to cover it up. From Partygate to the state of our prisons, and now back here, our public finances, the black hole that has been revealed today. What will my right honourable friend, the new Chancellor, do differently?
I thank my right honourable friend for that question. We have already introduced to Parliament legislation for a new fiscal lock, and we will publish a new Charter for Budget Responsibility at the time of the budget on the 30th of October. I've set out new institutional changes that I've given to the Office of Budget Responsibility to ensure that never again can a government withhold information from this House and from the country, and indeed from the Office of Budget Responsibility.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor claims to have discovered a black hole in this year's budget, and yet she's proposing to cut infrastructure investment for years to come. It makes no sense. One example is the Stonehenge tunnel, which was due to cost very little money this year, and that she's cancelled the whole thing. My constituents in Shrewton and Amesbury and all the villages around the A303 will be really disappointed to hear this news. What is she going to say to those residents? What will she do to relieve the traffic congestion that has blighted those communities for so long?
Well, the honourable gentleman's constituency will rightly be annoyed with the previous government for saying that they were going to go ahead with this A303 work, but not budgeting a single penny of money for it. That is where the responsibility lies for these failures and for the difficult announcements that I'm having to make today.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Cash-strapped councils are projected to spend £12 billion to support children with special educational needs and disabilities by 2026. That's up from £4 billion a decade ago. Does the Chancellor agree that the Tories' failure to get to grips with the SEND crisis has put public finances at risk while letting SEND children down?
Yes. I think every single member of this House will have faced constituency casework, often very difficult casework about young people who are not having their diagnosis on time and not getting the support they need at school. We'll be setting out all of our spending plans and priorities at the spending review later this year.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the Chancellor of the Exchequer and our team to their place. I'm concerned that I haven't seen anything in either the Chancellor's statement or the accompanying report in relation to 1950s women who suffered maladministration on their pensions. The PHS Ombudsman, who we all utilise as constituency casework MPs, were quite clear that that maladministration was suffered. So can the Chancellor confirm, is she considering the report? Will she provide a statement before the budget on the 30th of October? Or is the message to WASPI women today that she won't do it?
My right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, is considering that report as we speak.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For my constituents, this mess goes beyond money. It's about trust in politics. Does the Chancellor agree that the damage goes even deeper than the harm to our economy which she has set out?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, because it comes on top of Partygate, the handing of contracts to friends of donors to the Conservative Party during the pandemic, and now the revelations today of a £22 billion in-year overspend. That dents public trust, which is why I'm coming to the House today to be open and transparent about the state of the public finances and the action that I'm going to take to sort out this mess.
Chambers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your recent election. My training as a veterinary surgeon and my work in public health programmes around the world have taught me it is always more cost-effective to keep people healthy rather than treat them when they get sick. And Winchester, the hospital we have in Winchester, is a really good example where 20% of people in the A&E department are there because they can't get a GP appointment. You've got people there because they've got tooth root abscesses because they can't get dentist appointments, and 30% of people there on a mental health crisis, often already on a waiting list. Would the Chancellor agree with me that when finances are so stretched, there won't be the temptation to view primary care as a cost to be cut, but actually dentists, doctors, public health and mental health is actually an investment that will make the NHS more efficient and be better for patients and better for the taxpayer in the long run?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question, and I think he's absolutely right, and that's why the spending review will focus on both integration and prevention, because we know that that saves taxpayers money and delivers better outcomes for people.
Matt Termaine.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your election. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for her candour in the statement to the House this afternoon. My constituents are going to be bitterly disappointed by the consequences of the announcement that has been made, particularly in relation to the rebuild of Watford Hospital. promised under the last Labour government, scrapped by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, and then promised again and again in the run-up to this general election, where the party opposite said that the money was definitely there. Can the Chancellor tell me where was the money?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I think we've heard today that honourable and right honourable members right across the House campaigned in good faith on projects that they thought the money was there for, and the money simply was not there. And we cannot go on like this, which is why I've been open and transparent and honest about the state of our public finances and the £22 billion black hole that the previous government have left. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will meet with my honourable friend, member for Watford, and all MPs who are affected by the problems left by the previous government.
Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your new role. This Labour government has chosen to take the winter fuel payment away from the pensioners. The Honourable Lady does say that she will keep it for those on pension credit, but the threshold for that is very low, and that means that someone with an income of just £220 per week may find themselves receiving nothing. It is long established that being cold increases ill health among vulnerable people. So what estimate has she made of what her changes will cost the NHS?
Good question.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. Pension credit is paid to a single person who has an income of just under £12,000, and for a pensioner couple of just under £18,000. And we will indeed keep pension credit for the poorest pensioners and boost take-up of pension credit to ensure that everybody who's entitled to it gets it. But we cannot make promises. The previous government should not have made promises without being able to say where the money is going to come from. That is the road to ruin. We saw that with Liz Truss, and I'm afraid it was repeated under the current Leader of the Opposition and the current Shadow Chancellor. They should hang their heads in shame for what they have done to our public finances and to our public services.
Luke Charters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The OBR chair letter referenced earlier suggests we could now be facing one of the largest ever year-ahead expenditures outside of a pandemic. This level of cover-up would never be tolerated in the private sector. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is exactly why my constituents in York Outer deserve transparency about the state of the public finances?
Well, my honourable friend speaks powerfully on behalf of his constituents in York Outer. They voted for change because they were sick and tired of the unfunded commitments, the broken public services, the deterioration in living standards after 14 years of Conservative government. And today they've found the legacy that the previous government left is even worse than we could have anticipated, with a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I congratulate you on your post and the Honourable Lady to her position as Chancellor. Does the Honourable Lady, the Chancellor, share the anger of the people of Taunton and Wellington to find that not only is the whole new hospital that was promised by the Conservatives not funded, but also apparently even the maternity unit might not be funded, we now discover today? And on the Restoring Your Railways programme, can I ask the Chancellor whether that cancellation of projects will also apply to those like Wellington Station that have already begun funding and has had GRIP Stage 4 approval?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I can fully understand why his constituents are so angry with the previous government for leaving this mess and making unfunded commitments. I can give assurances that projects that have already started, like the station he's mentioned, will go ahead.
The final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you very much. I'm still the strongest legs in the chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank you for asking me to ask a question. Very pleased to hear the Chancellor's statement today and for her clear financial predicament that all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland are in together. Will the Chancellor confirm that in light of the budget gap and the welcome announcement of the junior doctor pay gap offer that savings will be made in ways that do not affect required pay increases but will focus on cutting back on unnecessary quangos, and reports of an estimated £500 million of taxpayers' money being spent on issues such as diversity and inclusion? Whilst important, they do not deserve priority in public spending, or vanity sub-projects such as Casement Park in Northern Ireland at the expense of our health staff. Thank you very much.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions and for persevering for so long this afternoon. I fully agree that the focus should be on frontline public services. It's why we've committed to a 2% efficiency savings in back office in all government departments and a reining in of consultancy spend and also government communication spend. Those things got out of hand under the previous government and we will rein them in. And can I just also say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we've been here for now than 2 hours, and in that time not a single Conservative Member of Parliament on either the front bench or the back bench has given a single apology for the state of the public finances and the state of our public services. That says all we need to know about that outgoing Conservative government, and they never should have their hands on power again.
Point of order, Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, could I raise a significant issue that I'm concerned about in relation to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's statement earlier today? In her remarks, she obviously doesn't want to stay here to hear this. In her remarks today, the Chancellor appeared to indicate that the government knowingly laid wrong or misleading estimates before the House on Thursday last week, which differ significantly from what she has presented today. 1 working day since those estimates were laid. This is a serious concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, if true. So what steps can we take to ensure that the government either retracts the estimates laid or the document that they produced today? And can you tell me whether this possibly constitutes a breach of the ministerial code?
Thank the honourable member for his point of order. He will know that the Chair is not responsible for the content of contributions made by ministers, but I'm sure the honourable member's concern has been heard on the government benches. If an error has been made in this instance, I'm sure the minister will seek to correct it as quickly as possible. It is for the government to decide on the estimates it puts before the House. Point of order, Kit Malthouse.
Point of order on the same issue, Madam Speaker. The Chancellor of the Exchequer made certain assertions about timing during her statement. However, we know from the media that the contents of this statement were briefed to The Guardian at 20:58 on Thursday, just after the estimates had been voted upon. Now, while I understand that the Chair is not responsible for the content of what is said at the dispatch box, the Chair is responsible for the integrity of documents that are laid before the House and on which we vote and rely upon. So could I ask whether this is a matter for the Prime Minister in his governance of the Ministerial Code, or the Commissioner for Standards in upholding standards within the House, please? Because it does, prima facie, in the absence of any evidence from the Chancellor, look as if we've all been misled. That's right.
Right, honourable member, for that point of order. He will know as well as I do that that is not for the Chair to decide, and it is for the government to decide what it puts in its estimates and in documents published.
Point of order.
Point of order, Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's on the same issue because the Chancellor has said, for transparency, she found out about everything this weekend. But last week, she said the Treasury also met with the OBR, which was prior to this weekend, to explain how bad things were. The two cannot be correct. Is it possible that she could come to the House and correct the record?
I've made it very clear that it is not a matter for the Chair. The government benches will have heard 3 points of order on the same subject, and if they wish to come to the House, I am sure the Chancellor will. The Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Bill, second reading.
No. Minister to move second reading.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time. At the general election, when millions of people called time on years of dysfunction, disruption and decline, they demanded change. Not only in how this country is governed, but in how it works. Because for too many, from our economy to our public services, this country simply does not work anymore. The things we rely on are letting us down too often. Lifelines have turned into liabilities. It's why this government has already started the work of rebuilding Britain, brick by brick, bill by bill. 5 transport bills in this year's King's Speech show not just the scale of our ambition, but how transport is at the heart of our plans for change. growing the economy, becoming a clean energy superpower, making our streets safer, spreading opportunity, rebuilding our NHS. Whatever this government's mission, transport is now mission critical. Yeah, very happy.
Thank you. I'm very grateful she gives way so early in her comments. In South Leicestershire, there is a very controversial planning proposal which is sitting on her desk as we speak. It's for the Hinckley National Rail Freight Interchange. Now, I'm for rail freight interchanges, but the issue about this one, which has united Labour, Liberal Democrat and Conservative politicians in and around the area, is that there are around 5 other rail freight interchanges within a 30-mile radius. Can she give a commitment at the dispatch box that whatever she says today will not ride roughshod over the views of Labour-led Rugby Council and Conservative-led Blaby District Council that both have very serious concerns about this matter?
Very grateful to the Honourable Member for putting his views on the record. He will know that I have a quasi-judicial role in determining the development consent order on that project. He's right that it's on my desk and I am considering it carefully. Nothing in today's bill will influence that decision. Madam Deputy Speaker, national renewal requires nothing less than the biggest overhaul of our public transport in a generation. And that starts with improving performance on our railways and kick-starting reform, which brings us to today's bill. Now, it should surprise no one in this House when I say our railways are not fit for purpose. I have said as much for 2.5 years from the benches opposite to no fewer than 3 Tory Transport Secretaries. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the new Shadow Transport Secretary to her place. I should note that her 3 predecessors that sat on this side are no longer members of this House, so I'm not sure whether it's her job that's cursed or mine, but I wish her luck in the role. And under those 3 Tory Transport Secretaries, we were promised reform. Yet 3 years after Keith Williams' review, little has changed. We were promised better services, yet some of the worst performing operators were rewarded with new, lengthy contracts and handed performance bonuses. We were promised... Yeah, there.
Good friend and Secretary of State for Transport give way. On that point, Avanti, when can we expect to see the shambles that is Avanti actually kicked into touch and returned into public ownership? I would certainly welcome that, and so would lots of Northerners up and down the country.
Very grateful for that intervention. I had a feeling he might be mentioning Avanti. He knows my views on Avanti, and they were one of the first meetings that I held as Secretary of State. I called them in as one of the worst performing operators with their Network Rail business unit, a meeting that was not held by any of my 3 predecessors whilst I was in the role as Shadow Secretary of State. I made clear that the levels of performance will not be tolerated, and we will be using all measures under their national rail contract to hold them to account, and that does not exclude terminating that contract before it expires if they default. Now, we were promised HS2 to Manchester, yet that was axed, in Manchester no less, leaving a West Coast main line that is now bursting at the seams. And meanwhile, passengers continue to suffer with overcrowded trains and poor facilities, record high cancellations with almost 1 in 3 trains late, some of the most expensive fares in Europe, and regular bouts of industrial action.
First of all, can I welcome the Minister to her place and wish her well in the new role that she undertakes, and for bringing this forward for the modernisation of the railway. I make a plea, if I can, for those who are disabled in particular. And all the time we've had debates in this chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether it be German debates or on railway, the issue of disabled access has come up over and over again. So on behalf of those people, does the Minister not agree that disabled access at all railway stations should be a bare minimum and must be a priority when we're having commuters who must still take private taxi hire to get to a wheelchair-friendly station? And further, will the Minister not agree that rural communities should not be disadvantaged by the closure of small stops in order to provide more streamlined timings? Thank you so much.
Very grateful to the honourable member and marvel, as I always do, at his ability to find something of interest and relevant to whatever the debate at hand. He's absolutely right. Accessibility is far too often overlooked, and we have made clear in the plans we set out ahead of the general election that accessibility will be one of the key measures against which we hold eventually Great British Railways to account. It is undignified the way that people with accessibility needs are treated by our public transport system. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, the broken model that our railways relies on is holding back talent, holding back opportunity, holding back Britain, and it must be fixed. And we're wasting no time in doing so. By amending the Railways Act 1993, today's bill will fulfil one of our central manifesto commitments to bring rail passenger services into public ownership. It overturns the privatisation of the John Major government, and it allows us to take action as soon as contracts expire or earlier if operators default on those contracts. It is a sensible approach, ensuring taxpayers don't fork out huge sums to compensate operating companies for ending contracts early. Public ownership will become the default option for delivering passenger services instead of the last resort.
First of all, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on her appointment as Secretary of State and thank her for bringing this excellent bill. Since becoming the operator of last resort, TransPennine Trains, which had been one of the worst performing rail companies, became the most improved operator. So will this public ownership of rail bill mean that passengers on South Western Railway will see the same level of improvement, and how long will it take?
Very grateful to my honourable friend's intervention. She's absolutely right that we've seen immediate improvements on bringing previously privately run operators into public ownership. But we can go further still, and that's the benefit of taking the two-prong approach that I will set out later in my speech. But she should be on no doubt that South Western will be brought into public ownership, and all contracts remaining will be done so within the first term of this government, and ideally within the first 3 years of this bill receiving royal assent. We will act swiftly. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I've no doubt we'll hear plenty of voices from the benches opposite labelling this as an ideological move. Those accusations are way off the mark. There is nothing ideological about fixing what's broken and about reforming what doesn't work.
But my honourable friend, give way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. She's being extremely generous. I very much welcome this bill, and I congratulate her for all her work on getting us to this point. Since our railways were taken out of public ownership, tens of billions of pounds have been lost to shareholder dividends and the inefficiency of a privatised system, all while ticket prices have soared. Does she agree with me that it's high time that we put passengers before profiteers?
Very grateful to my honourable friend, and she's exactly right. That's what's at the heart of these proposals, the opportunity to genuinely reform our railways from top to bottom to ensure that passengers and growing the railways are the only objective that they should serve, not private operators, not shareholders, not the whims of engineers that run Network Rail. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make sure that our public transport system serves the public. So it's not ideological. What was ideological was the previous government sitting back and presiding over a broken system whilst passengers and the economy paid a heavy price. I know the Tories have been trying to pretend the last 14 years of failure haven't happened, but they cannot deny that after 30 years of privatisation, we find ourselves in a position where taxpayers are responsible for 50% of the rail industry's income and underwrite almost every penny spent, whilst profits are siphoned off to shareholders. Yeah.
I'm grateful to my humble friend giving way, and also on her appointment as Secretary of State. I note within the proposed legislation that in clause 2, it talks about the extension of the current contracts. Could she set out the circumstances by which that can occur? Because we know that rail safety is best when track and train are brought together, as it would under Great British Railways.
Very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. That clause is in there purely as a fail-safe if, for whatever reason, the DOHL is not able, for capacity reasons, at that moment in time when the private operator's contract expires, to take it in. So we've allowed ourselves that flexibility if it is not practically possible, but in order to demonstrate that it's not enabling franchising or private operations by the back door, we have also included the power to remove that power again to make sure that public ownership remains the default. So that will only be in absolutely exceptional circumstances for a very limited time. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Railways Passenger-in-Chief, I am acting decisively today. This is the only response to the failure of privatisation to deliver reliable and affordable services for passengers. And it makes financial sense, saving tens of millions of pounds each year in private sector fees, money which can now be reinvested into the railway. It makes operational sense by running the railways in the interests of passengers and taxpayers, not to the benefit of shareholders. Yeah, and then I will make some progress.
I really thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on her new position. But as a long-suffering West Coast Avanti passenger, I really welcome the fact that this government has prioritised this bill. But would my honourable friend agree with me that workers should not be outsourced who work on the railways? And could she say a little about what she intends to do to achieve that going forward?
I'm very grateful for that intervention. Network Rail has done a considerable amount of work over the last few years at looking in sourcing, and I will ask them to do a more comprehensive review to see if there is further that they can do. And as private operators are brought in, they will absolutely consider the position of their contracts and supply chains as well to ensure that they are delivering the best possible service for passengers. She raises a very important point. The case for public ownership should not be controversial. After all, rail infrastructure was brought into public ownership by the last Labour government following private sector failure. European neighbours, including Germany, France and Spain, all have models of public ownership. And indeed, the architect of the previous government's rail reform plan endorsed Labour's plans ahead of the general election. And as has been said, 4 franchises, Northern, TransPennine, South Eastern and LNER, are already in public hands and have seen some improvements. Take TransPennine, still far from perfect. As someone who relies on it, I accept it is far from perfect, but overseeing a fall in cancellations from 20% in January 2023 to around 5% since it was taken into public ownership. Or LNER, who recently achieved a financial surplus which was returned to the taxpayer. Bringing the remaining 10 operators under public control will take time. But as Passenger-in-Chief, I am putting them on notice. I will not tolerate the status quo. I will not hesitate to demand improvements, and I won't be afraid to rip up contracts early if operators default on their obligations to the public. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's bill means the railways will finally be run for the public, by the public. But owning the House is just the first step. Next, we must fix the crumbling foundations. That means fundamental reform. No ifs, no buts. We will set up Great British Railways as a new directing mind, running the network, both track and train, as one integrated system. Will finally put an end to the fragmentation and waste which makes our railways one of the least efficient, the spiralling costs and falling revenues, the competing interests and industry inertia, and we will build a growing, innovative railway relentlessly and single-mindedly focused on passengers. There's no questioning the benefits at stake, because GBR will take a whole system view. We'll be able to simplify the overly complex fare system so passengers are confident they're getting the best value. We'll take aim at overcrowding by moving rolling stock to where it's needed in the network. We'll end the piecemeal approach to innovation and roll out benefits like digital pay-as-you-go and digital season tickets. And we'll put accessibility at the core of our rail offer so passengers with disabilities can expect a consistent level of service. Of course, change like this does not happen overnight. It's why setting up GBR and delivering our plans in full will be the focus of separate legislation later in the session. But we won't sit back and wait for that legislation to be on the books. We plan to use every lever available to us to urgently improve services for passengers. That includes creating shadow Great British Railways, which will focus squarely on driving improvements in the short term, from ticketing to better services. This is a crucial next step, putting passengers back at the heart of the railways and firing the starting gun for reform. Yes, just before I conclude.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I'd like to ask her what benefit this bill will bring to my constituents of North Cornwall, who currently don't have a single railway station. Please could the Secretary of State explain to my constituents what mainline train services will be coming to towns in North Cornwall, such as Bude, Bodmin, Weybridge and Launceston?
The Chancellor set out today, will be reviewing absolutely not just the previous government's unfunded, underfunded and in some places cancelled capital projects, but will be absolutely taking forward an integrated long-term infrastructure strategy. I'd be delighted to meet with him to talk about the needs facing his constituents. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I became Transport Secretary, I told the department that we had a new motto: to move fast and fix things. Today's public ownership bill, the first major piece of legislation under this Labour government, shows we are doing exactly that. The 30-year privatisation experiment has failed. Passenger satisfaction remains too low whilst costs soar. Even before the pandemic, half of all trains in the north of England were late. All of this failure has consequences. Communities cut off, talent stifled, ambition limited. It leaves Britain stuck in the sidings, unable to realise this government's mission of economic growth. Today, we start the work of repair, bringing our railways back into public service, restoring pride to an industry we should be proud of, and taking back control so that our railways finally work for everyone wherever they live. In this mission, I am absolutely determined, and I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Helen Whately.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what a pleasure it is to speak with you in the chair. Congratulations on your election. It is my honour to respond to the first bill this new government is putting before the House, and I see it as an opportunity to set the tone for how we will act in opposition. We're not going to oppose for the sake of it. And I don't believe you will find a single person on either side of this House, the public, those working on the rail network, or indeed even those running the train companies, who would say everything is as it should be with our rail system. We are in no doubt. Rail needs reform. COVID fundamentally changed the way we travel. Far fewer people now commute 5 days a week. The contracts that were brought in to save the railways are now stifling the companies they kept afloat, and the Treasury is subsidising the day-to-day running of the network to the tune of £3 billion a year. So things need to change. That's why we in government commissioned a landmark review into our rail system. Now, I welcome that Labour are taking forward our plan for Great British Railways, the product of that review. Joining up track and train into a single public body will make the system more efficient and save passengers time and money, and that's important because affordability and reliability are what people care about, and this is the point of being in government, delivering on what people care about. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am worried about what this legislation tells us about how the Labour Party plan to act in government. A worry I had when I first saw this bill, but multiplied many times over by the statement we heard from the Chancellor earlier, which I will come to later. But the problem with this bill is that it seems to be based solely in ideology. There is no evidence in fact barely even a suggestion that this bill is going to actually improve journeys for passengers. The Right Honourable Lady opposite has, perhaps to her credit, even admitted so herself, saying that she cannot promise that fares will be any cheaper, nor the trains more likely to run on time. This bill is the embodiment of the same old Labour mantra that anything run by the state is simply better than anything run by the private sector, and that the answer to a problem is putting politicians in charge, when it has been proven time and again that this isn't the case. I'm happy to give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the Shadow Secretary for finally giving way. The Shadow Secretary referred to being ideologically wedged to a certain model of providing services, railway services. Could the Shadow Secretary explain why, despite the appalling record of anti-West Coast Main Line, it was awarded a 9-year extension? Surely that was an ideological decision, the wrong decision.
Well, actually, the point that I'm going to come to is that we on this side of the House, and me as Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, don't choose to take an ideological approach. The important thing is what works. And if he will hold on a moment to listen to what I'm coming to, he will understand my argument there. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I confess I may be a little jealous if the Right Honourable Lady opposite is too young to remember life under British Rail. The dusty carriages, the worn seats, the clonk and rattle of the carriage doors, hours spent waiting on a deserted platform wondering if, let alone when, your train would ever arrive with no information to tell you. Of course, even the sandwiches were tired. It's no wonder that over British Rail's nearly 50-year history, passenger numbers across the network actually went down. There was a reason that private provision was introduced into the rail network. And there was a reason why the previous Labour government stuck with it throughout the 13 years they were in power, because it worked. Today's railway is unrecognisable from that under British Rail, not despite privatisation, but because of it. In the first 20 years, passenger numbers doubled. A point that Labour's own rail minister, who now sits in the other place, made in his 2015 report as the head of Network Rail. And the majority of this growth is attributable to the private sector's involvement, and it was achieved while operating one of the safest railways in Europe. Billions of pounds of private capital has been invested in rolling stock. There is now live, real-time information on services, and instead of British Rail catering, passengers can now choose between the likes of M&S and Greggs. The railway went from costing taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds a year to generating an operating surplus for much of the 2010s. And it wasn't just taxpayers and passengers that benefited. To quote the General Secretary of ASLEF, Lou Adams, back in 2004, all the time it was in the public sector, all we got were cuts, cuts, cuts. And today, there are more members in the trade union, more train drivers and more trains running. The reality is that it worked. Madam Deputy Speaker, we often hear it said in this country that our rail system should be more like those in Europe, where under a utopian system of public ownership, the trains always run on time and every journey costs less than a pint of beer. But that's not how the Europeans see it. In fact, in terms of the growth in passenger numbers and the controls on costs that privatisation delivered, our network is actually envied by Europe. It's why many... I knew you'd laugh. So listen to what I'm about to say. Listen, let me just... I will take you in, but not right now. Let me just, because I heard that reaction. But this is why many European countries are right now in the process of unravelling their public models and introducing private provision and competition into their networks. The Dutch, the Czechs, the European Union will, Madam Deputy Speaker, all be very confused to see us hurtling past them in the other direction. Of course, free enterprise doesn't always succeed. That's why we already have a system in place for times when state intervention would, or at least should, benefit passengers. And as I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady knows, the Department for Transport is already running a number of train operating companies. Companies like Northern Trains, which was taken into public ownership back in 2020. 4 years ago, when the state took it over, a measly 61% of their trains arrived on time. Today, free from the greedy profit vultures who previously feasted on its carcass, that figure remains at 61%. Compare that with Greater Anglia, whose contract comes up for renewal in September. They, by the way, are the first train operating company the Right Honourable Lady's crosshairs, and why the government is choosing to rush this second reading through before recess. All of their services are running new trains. 94% of those trains arrive within 3 minutes of the scheduled time. They managed to deliver this while paying a premium back to the Treasury. It's not failing. In fact, every single one of the top 5 performers across the network are private performers. By contrast, do you know who accounts for more delays than anyone else? Network Rail. 60% of delays are caused by a single public sector organisation. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I am old enough to remember British Rail, and actually on quite a lot of measures, British Rail was improving before it was privatised. And while the Honourable Lady wants to make an ideological attack on a state-owned railway, British Rail was 40% more efficient than 8 comparable rail systems in Europe used as benchmarks in 1989. So did the Honourable Member agree with the former Secretary of State Grant Shapps when he admitted that the franchise system was no longer sustainable? And what's her idea?
I was perfectly clear at the beginning of my speech that we agree that reform is needed. That's why we commissioned a review in government, and that's why we set out ambitious plans for reform, including the Great British Railways plan, which I said I will welcome that this new government is intending to introduce. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not here to make an ideological argument. In fact, and this is the point to respond to the honourable gentleman earlier, sometimes, like with our plan for Great British Railways, the public sector is the right vehicle to solve the problem. At other times, a competitive private model will lead to better results. And the point is, if you're going to change things, in the first piece of legislation you bring before this House, you need some pretty clear evidence on why. So I have some questions for my right honourable friend and her junior minister, for the right honourable lady, and her junior minister who will be summing up. How exactly will bringing train operating companies into public ownership benefit passengers? Because unfortunately, the government's impact assessment for sure doesn't tell us. What improvements can passengers expect to see? Who is she going to get to run these companies? Where are all these different better train operating experts going to come from? If they're out there twiddling their thumbs in the hope that this day would arrive, well, wouldn't the Department for Transport not have brought them on board already to help with the running of Northern trains or South Eastern? It's the same question across the network. Will she be sacking everyone currently working for the train operating companies and replacing them with a horde of superior yet currently out of work staff? Or, as I expect, will passengers simply encounter the same group of people in a different colour shirt? For what we need to hear is what tangible difference is this going to make for passengers? Because if the answer is nil, then there are lots of other things she could be doing with her time, like prioritising the railways bill, the piece of legislation that is actually going to make a difference to how passengers experience our railways, with simpler tickets, joined-up decision-making and efficiency savings that can be passed on to passengers. Or like modernising working practices, instead of bending over backwards to the unions, as reports are suggesting she has already done. How does she think that creating a single employer, and in the process uplifting every rail worker's terms and conditions to the least favourable for passengers, will benefit the network? Or she could start by saving the train manufacturer Hitachi, something that, when in opposition, she said she could do with a stroke of a pen. I notice that it's been 3 weeks, and that pen is yet to materialise. Perhaps she no longer takes for granted the work her predecessor did, saving the Olsen factory in Derby. Or she could prioritise investment in the network, like the $100 billion we spent improving the railways since 2010. And on that point, I feel for her. I know what it's like to argue with your Chancellor because you want investment in something and not win the argument. And it's clear from the statement we heard earlier from the Chancellor that she lost the argument pretty catastrophically. Yeah. That rather than setting out to reform welfare or control public spending, the Chancellor opted to slash a host of transport infrastructure projects and is now going to review all transport infrastructure plans, putting the entire transport pipeline into chaos, letting down communities across the country, letting down a fair few of her new colleagues too, who will be dismayed to find that they campaigned on false promises to the electorate, that their pledges to invest in economic growth and not to raise taxes were not even worth the glossy paper their leaflets were written on. And while I know what it's like to lose an argument with the Chancellor, I don't share the experience she and many of her colleagues will now be going through of changing their tune just 3 weeks after they were given a mandate by the electorate and less than 2 weeks after their party leader said that trust is a new battleground of politics. It seems like he has given up that battle already. But all the same, I welcome the Right Honourable Lady to her post, and I do genuinely wish her well. I will gladly offer my support to anything she does to make our railways more reliable and more affordable. This bill isn't going to do that. It's a rush piece of left-wing ideology. The evidence, both here in the UK and across Europe, shows that an effective public-private model where the incentives are properly aligned delivers more choice, more passengers and greater efficiency. Now, over the next few weeks of recess, she and her team will have some time to reflect and reconsider. And I hope they will return in the autumn with a bill that jettisons the baggage of ideology and takes up the mantle of evidence. A bill that would have more prospect of improving the rail service for passengers. Because, as I said, I have no interest in opposing just for opposition's sake. But this bill, as it stands, will not be receiving the support of His Majesty's loyal opposition.
Andy MacDonald.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your elevation. I wish to put on record as I start my contribution how proud I am of my relationship with our trade union movement, and I declare and support both the political and financial support I've received, including from affiliated and non-affiliated railway trade unions, as reflected in my register of interests. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is an immense honour to speak in the second reading of this most welcome of bills today. In the recent election, we set out in our manifesto how we will put passengers at the heart of the service by reforming the railways and bringing them into public ownership. And with today's bill, that is what we are doing. The restoration of our railways to public ownership is something I've spent much time working to achieve in this place, especially in the 4 years from 2016 as Shadow Transport Secretary. In that role, I produced a document, a shadow white paper, entitled GB Rail, Labour's plan for a nationally integrated, publicly owned railway. And it was nice to see that the then Transport Secretary tried to pinch the title, but I suppose that I should be flattered by that. In it, I set out how the privatised UK railway hasn't delivered for passengers or taxpayers for a long time. I said when we published our paper that I believe the railways must be run with the public interest as its primary objective. And I was looking at the sector more broadly, not just as passenger services, but I am delighted that this bill is before us today. I heartily congratulate the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Heeley, on securing the first substantive debate and moving the first piece of legislation under this Labour government. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is necessary because the privatisation model for Britain's railways, brought in by the major government in the 1993 Railway Act, has long been failing passengers. Even Margaret Thatcher was reluctant to privatise rail. But the privatised rail system has put private profit-taking before the provision of public service. Far too many of Britain's train franchises have been wholly or partly run by the subsidiaries of other countries' publicly owned railway companies. Over the years, Deutsche Bahn, Nederlandse Spoorwegen and Trenitalia, to name just a few, have extracted value out of our railways to pump back into their own home railways, and yet the only nation state that was precluded from running railways here was our own. Well, all that changes today. I've previously said that the primary aim of Britain's railways should be supporting the health of the economy and society, not other nation-states and a small group of private franchise shareholders. The outgoing model has resulted in what is and should function as a public service being subsumed to the commercial objectives